A beautiful blonde girl says that many crazy things had happened to her. She approaches a young man who was tied to a chair. The boy questions what the woman wants to talk about and warns that he is not an easy person, but she gets irritated and asks what his name is and what he had come to do there. Then the young man says his name was Jiang Chen. The girl laughs at his name. Jiang Chen says that everyone thought his name was incredible and that it matched a handsome guy. However, the woman kicks the boy's chair and almost hits his most precious items. Frightened, the young man says he was a descendant of 9 generations of his family and asks if she wanted to end his lineage. The girl says he would answer exactly what she asked, and that, if he started trying to deceive her, she wouldn't mind wiping out his lineage once and for all. The woman asks where the boy came from, since she had never seen him in this city, and Jiang Chen says he came from the north. Then she asks where he got a soda, and the boy says he couldn't explain. Once again, the girl gets irritated and kicks his chair. Jiang Chen says to just kill him already instead of scaring him. The girl points a gun to the boy's head and says she will grant his wish. The young man asks if that's how she treats someone who just saved her life. The girl in turn puts the gun away and says maybe she went too far, and she asks if the boy was from the Northern Alliance. However, Jiang Chen says he was from a richer place and had come there to collect components for someone, and that he thought things would get really dark after he told everything he knew. The girl says she didn't know what they were going to find in the city since everything had already been taken. The young man then says maybe she could help him as he had just arrived there and would need a guide. The girl asks how she would be paid, and Jiang tells her to put her hand in his pocket. Pulling out a carrot, the boy says she could consider that a starter gift for their partnership. The girl gets excited, and the young man, in turn, says there was much more where that carrot came from. Right after, he asks the girl what her name is. She says her name is Sun Zhou, and that if she noticed anything suspicious in this partnership, she would send him straight to the afterlife. Jiang Chen says he would never do such a thing because all he needed was an experienced guide. Then the girl asks what he was looking for. The boy says they were after technology, like the equipment she had, and mentions that they couldn't produce them, so he had decided to come to the city to look for technology. Sun Zhou says that many people in the city make those things and that she thought the boy wasn't telling everything. And Jiang Chen says he can only use those items as an example since his technology was more advanced. Then the girl asks to talk about her reward, and the young man gets nervous, thinking about what currency they used in that world. Then he decides to ask how the girl would like to be rewarded, and she, in turn, says she personally preferred to be paid with food. Right after, she asks if the boy still had cans of chicken curry, but the boy says she had already eaten everything, and Sun Zhou asks if he was trying to deceive her. Then, she tries to kick him again. However, Jiang Chen says he would pay her with 10 cans of food a month and take care of all her meals. The girl smiles, saying the deal was sealed, and the boy says that since they had agreed, she should untie him. Then, Sun unties the young man from the chair. The boy cries because he had been tied for so long that his hands had gone numb. Then the girl says that now his safety was in her hands, but the young man says she was only protecting him because if he died, no one would pay her. Then Sun Zhou asks if they were going to leave, and Jiang Chen asks why they should leave, because monsters were all around. The girl says not to worry because that place was the safest around. That was the city of Wanhai in 2190, where zombies and unknown creatures roamed the streets. And Jiang Chen thinks that, as a recent graduate from 2017, he shouldn't be there, because he had time traveled. However, instead of going back in time, he had traveled to a parallel universe similar to Earth. Jiang Chen thinks that not even in his dreams would he imagine gaining a skill like that. In June 2017, the boy is talking to his mother. She asks him how the job search is going, and the young man in turn responds that it's going well, but his mother asks if he's calling to ask for money. The boy says his allowance had run out and that this would be the last time he asked for money, but the woman reminds him that he had graduated a year ago. Jiang Chen says no one gets a good job in less than a year, but his mother starts comparing him to his cousin. Then, if things were tough, he could come back home, as his father needed help on the pig farm, but the boy says he doesn't want to feed the animals. His mother gets irritated, saying those pigs were the young man's livelihood. And then Jiang Chen hangs up the phone. Right after, he pulls a soda from his pocket and drinks while talking about how to break this curse that had been cast on him. Then the boy sees a shooting star, wishing for a good job and that he would take the work seriously. He gets excited, saying he would dedicate himself and get promoted. However, the star takes a turn and heads straight for the boy, who ends up being hit by it, and that accident gave him the incredible ability to travel through the multiverse. His forearm became marked with a tattoo that extends to his wrist, thus allowing him to travel through the multiverse. Jiang Chen also discovered that the tattoo contained an independent subspace, giving him a small dimensional storage. The boy decides to make his first trip through the multiverse, taking him only to an abandoned house. Jiang Chen thinks that no one must have visited that house in years. Then he notices newspapers scattered on the floor and decides to read them to see if there was any clue about what happened. However, the newspapers said that it was the year 2190 and that this was still the city of Wanhai, but completely different. He then decides to take a look at how the world was. But a purple monster appears in the window and the boy decides to go back for now as the place seemed dangerous. so he decides to return to his world. However, he realizes that the tattoo had disappeared after the trip. Then he decides to stick his fingers into the outlet, thinking it would recharge him, but that ends up shocking the boy. Then he says there must be something valuable in that world and that he needed to find a way to return. But he knows he couldn't go back there without a plan, so he decides to go to the market to buy supplies for the trip. Right after shopping, he finally returns to that world, saying that everything was quiet in the place, and that it seemed like the zombies didn't come out during the day. But he still needed to be careful, as he didn't know anything about that world. Right after, the protagonist says he first needed to find a safe place, and then he finds a building and says it would do. However, the door was locked and he decides to look through the window to see if anyone was inside, but says it seemed like no one was there and decides to enter. Jiang Chen comments that the house seemed uninhabited for years, so it should be safe. Then someone grabs his leg, and the boy gets scared, kicking the person in the head, but he realizes it was a human. The girl says she was going to kill the boy. Jiang Chen crouches down and asks her what happened, and Sun Zhou in turn responds that she needed water. The boy says she was in luck because he had extra water in his backpack, and then he gives the water to the girl. Then he asks how she feels, but the girl says she's hungry. Jiang Chen says he had brought canned food. Then he gives his food to the girl. Back to the present, Sun Zhou locks the doors. Jiang thinks that luckily she still seemed to have some humanity left, and that if he had found a cannibal or a slave trader, the situation would be different. The girl asks how he would transport the supplies. Then the young man replies that his partners have their way. The protagonist sees some paintings that must be worth millions, but those painters didn't exist in his world, so selling them was out of the question. Then he comments that those objects were quite advanced for his people. Sun Zhou says that those objects stopped working after the nuclear explosions, but she could still remove some important components to trade for something useful at the survivor bases. The boy thinks that there were already similar objects in his time. The girl says there's no use reinforcing the doors and that they just needed to speak quietly so the zombies wouldn't enter. Jiang Chen says he was preparing against human intruders, and that they would stay in that city for a while, so that would be their supply warehouse. He then asks if the girl had any map of the area. Sun asks where his iPad was as she would send it to him, but the boy is confused about what that was. She then shows him hers, and mentions that it was hard to imagine he would explore an unknown city without one of those and hands hers to him to try. Jiang says it worked and asks where she got it from. The girl replies that she took it from the body of an unlucky person. After pressing a button on the device, the protagonist's stats appear. Sun Zhou smiles and says that none of his skills are over 20, and asks if he was really a man. Jiang Chen asks if the girl wants to check, but the girl points her gun at him. The protagonist thinks she is too dangerous for him, and it's better to leave that kind of fun for his civilized world. And Sun Zhou, in turn, thinks she should stop insulting her meal ticket since she no longer has to worry about going hungry, and that he seemed like an innocent and kind person. Although in that world, the word kind is synonymous with a joke, that world was full of treasures, and the boy thinks that even the most trivial equipment there could surpass any prototype for his world's science. But it wasn't possible to take these devices to sell them. He then says he needed gold from that place. Sun Zhou asks why he needed that. Jiang Chen replies that in this world, the value of gold must be close to zero, and no one would leave a plate of food behind to give more value to jewels. Then the boy gives a loaf of bread to the girl, saying that this was her breakfast, and since she was going out, he gives her another can. The girl's eyes fill with tears, for she had already seen the scum of humanity kill their own companions for food, and had even encountered cannibal bandits who tried to turn her into food. This was the first time she had met someone who cared if she was hungry. Jiang Chen says that eating something in the morning would give her more energy. Sun Zhou in turn thanks him, and says she will do her best to find the gold in the city's banks, but transporting them would be harder than finding them, because electromagnetic pulses had destroyed most of the city's electronics, so they couldn't use cars. The boy tells her to focus on investigating the locations and that she should return before nightfall. Then Sun Zhou packs her supplies into her backpack, but before leaving, Jiang Chen asks her to show her status, and the girl, in turn, shows her stats, leaving the young man surprised, wondering if she was still human. Immediately after, the boy decides to return to his world. Lying in his bed, he thinks he should recharge his tattoo. However, he realizes that putting his fingers in the socket would take too long, so he decides to use the battery of a power box. But the lights in the entire neighborhood go out, and the residents get irritated. The boy decides to flee the area. While lying in his bed, he says he should find a solution to his problem, and it would be better if there was something else to replace energy recharges. The boy looks at his iPad, which warns that when radiation levels exceed 50, the user's life will begin to be affected, and that it's recommended to store 1,000 in his EP, and he wonders if iodine dye would work. But the young man decides to go prepare something to eat. While eating, he wonders how many kilos of gold a meal like that would be worth in the apocalyptic world, and thanks for not living in that world. But he knows that if a third world war happened in his world, a graduate like him wouldn't stand a chance. Then he tells himself to stop thinking about such things, and decides to check his supplies to return to the apocalyptic world. Upon returning to that world, Jiang Chen realizes he hadn't even consumed half of his strength, and that his weight hadn't changed, wondering if his storage capacity had increased. Then he says he had other things to put into practice. Arriving at the kitchen, he wonders how to handle that thing that looked like a power panel. Then he pulls a lever, and the entire kitchen powers up. Jiang Chen says it wasn't so bad living in that world. Then he sees Sun Jiao at the gate and says she seemed to have brought something. The girl tries to jump over the gate, but the young man presses a button, and the gate opens automatically, making the girl fall to the ground. She gets irritated and asks if he was trying to kill her. But right after, she says the bank was full of zombies and she had to use ammunition to clear the place, but she had taken some gold bars. Jiang says that it was very heavy, and asks if she carried all that weight herself. He then gives a soda to the girl, as he says she seemed to like it a lot. Sun Jiao drinks the beverage, and says it was very good but asks how it was cold, and the boy says the fridge in the place still worked. Right after, Sun Jiao asks what they would do next, and that she thought they would need a professional if the plan was to blow up the bank vault, since they would need explosives or a hacker to unlock the electronic lock. Jiang Chen asks where they would get all those things. Sun Jiao in turn replies that they have them at the survivor bases, like in the city of Luding, and that it was an interesting place to visit, but she warns that things there were expensive, because visitors had to pay a unit of crystallized energy or items of equivalent value to enter. She then shows the crystallized energy, saying that it contained about 37 units of energy. She could check using the EP, but it wasn't easy to get one of those since only powerful mutants had crystals at the back of their heads. When the protagonist picks up the stone, he realizes it recharges his tattoo. Sun Jiao says that energy source was used as currency. Then the boy decides to exchange 37 energy units for 3 cans of food, and the girl agrees to the deal. But she warns him that if he keeps trading like that with others, they will take advantage of him. She then mentions that this would be her first time eating chicken curry, since the best thing she had ever eaten was a mutant cow steak, and even though it was dry, it was enough to make her feel satisfied. Jiang Chen thinks that the world wasn't as simple as he had thought. Then he observes all the gold he had already collected and wonders if he should stop there, because he could die at any moment if he continued in that world. And even though he was very scared, he couldn't show it to the girl. Sun Jiao says that since he was her employer, it was also her responsibility to make sure he didn't get scammed by thieves. The protagonist stares at her and wonders if she's trying to calm him down. The girl in turn asks him to stop looking at her like that, as she was starting to get scared. Then she opens the fridge and is impressed. Jiang Chen says the fridge was still working, so to celebrate, they would eat something fresh that night. The girl gets excited by the variety of food. The protagonist asks her to calm down as he would answer her questions while they ate, and that they would eat fried eggs with tomatoes that night. The girl remembers how happy she was with her parents and younger sister. Compared to the nuclear hell that lasted for years inside that shelter, it was like heaven. But after discovering the hard way that groups of mercenaries targeted shelters with little defense to attack, those men took advantage of the kindness and innocence of the people newly emerged from the shelters to steal their supplies. And that's how Sun Jiao grew up, becoming a survivor. Jiang Chen asks her to calm down as she was about to cut the table instead of the tomatoes, and wonders when the last time she cooked was. Immediately after, he says that those ingredients were created with a lot of hard work and dedication, so she needed to treat them with care. She needed to put her heart and soul into cooking. While eating, Sun Jiao says that probably no one in that devastated land had ever eaten such good food, and that she couldn't explain what she was feeling at that moment. It was like being in a fairy tale. The girl says that there were some books before the war in her shelter that they called fairy tales. In the story, everyone lived happily, so that must be a fairy tale. Then Jiang Chen gets up, saying he would be right back. When he returns with beers in his arms, he says that in his world, people used to drink to feel better. Sun Jiao takes a can. However, she doesn't really like the taste and says soda is better. But the boy says that drink helps to get rid of any bad thoughts. And then they both start to get drunk. Under the effect of alcohol, the boy says that the monsters outside were nothing, and that in his world there was a monster called graduation that was the terror of freshmen. It not only devoured students' monthly expenses, but also their parents' money. So they had to carry their dreams on their backs with hard work, and that was a buff to give them strength. The girl in turn asks what a buffet was, and Jiang Chen replies that this would be the solution to strengthen that world. He continues saying that she would have to work to survive, and that she would have a boss who would torture her every hour. But Sun Jiao says that given her physical status, she would be the one doing the torturing. Then the boy takes the woman's drink, as she was already very drunk. However, the girl puts him in an arm lock, asking how he had the nerve to steal from her. But the protagonist manages to break free and throws the girl to the ground. Right after, he says he will teach her who the boss is. Immediately, Sun Jiao says she wants to be on top, and the boy asks how she was so strong. The next day, both are lying in bed. Jiang Chen apologizes in case he forced anything, and says he will take responsibility for what he did. The girl smiles, asking if he will protect her forever, like those things couples usually do. But she warns that she wasn't easy to maintain, and that she had many enemies, though the protagonist says he wasn't afraid of them. Sun Jiao mentions there was still something she had to do at any cost, and the young man says he will help her, so she could trust him. Then the girl kisses the protagonist and asks if he's just going to keep staring as he is now her man. Jiang Chen asks Sun Jiao to wait for him as he was tired from the night before, but the girl tells him to hurry, asking him to stay close. Looking up, the young man notices the sky is overcast and asks if it was going to rain. Sun Jiao in turn replies that it was radioactive dust. The boy says they were completely exposed to radiation without any protection, but the girl says that as long as her EP contains iodine, the radiation level wouldn't exceed the limit. Jiang Chen thinks he wouldn't be in that situation if not for the crazy idea. The night before, the girl had said the young man needed to learn a few things about combat, but the protagonist says he thought he was more of a support class. The girl in turn gets irritated and says he will go out with her the next day. Then Sun Jiao tells the boy to wait, because they were going to pass through an area infested with zombies. And she tells the young man to grab his weapon because the best place to learn to shoot is on the battlefield. But since the protagonist was still a novice, she recommends he start with a kinetic weapon. She then gives him an assault rifle. As they walk, Jiang Chen asks if those mutants wouldn't attack them. And Sun Jiao explains that not all creatures attacked because despite being large, they still had a physiological fear of humans. And the zombies weren't very active during the day since the cells in their heads needed a stable environment to perform photosynthesis. However, they still needed to watch out for carnivorous types. And lastly, if anyone aimed for his head, he should shoot without thinking twice. Jiang Chen thinks that the world was really dangerous. Then the girl says something is wrong as all the nearby mutants are fleeing and surely something more powerful is around. Probably some carnivorous species like the Deathclaw. Right after, an explosion occurs, and the girl runs off saying a battle is happening and asks the boy to follow her. The protagonist in turn says that if he continues with that crazy woman, he will get into trouble sooner or later. A man yells for them to keep shooting and throw explosives. Then all the soldiers begin firing at a mutant. Sun Jiao watches everything and thinks it's a mountain of flesh, and wonders why that species had appeared in that area. The soldier says they won't hold out much longer. Then they fire a missile at the monster, and the creature gets angry. However, the creature takes a precise shot to its head, causing it to be defeated. Sun Jiao says that only an anti-tank cannon could take down that monster. Jiang Chen asks what those men were doing. The girl in turn replies that they were collecting crystals, and also that the fat from the mountain of flesh could be used as fertilizer. Then the two of them approach, and the soldier asks them to present their genetic codes. Genetic codes are a genetic sequence calculated based on specific algorithms used as identity for EP users. Right after, the gate opens, and the man says the couple can enter without any problems. Jiang Chen says he always thought that world was completely wild, but he believed he had only witnessed a little of the civilization there. Civilization is the accumulation of humanity's beliefs and creations since the beginning of time, and in that case, humanity was clearly still there. However, it developed abnormally, and if he had to describe it in one word, the level of technology would be disproportionate. He could see a merchant calculating his earnings on a holographic computer, while seeing people missing limbs was common. And if he had to describe life on 6th Street in one word, it would be unequal. There were men and women looking like bags of bones everywhere, so weak they no longer had the energy to cry or beg for food. Sun Jiao said that this was normal because 6th Street was the operations base of the region, and that the laws there were quite simple. If you killed or stole, you were executed, and if you cheated, you were expelled, and property damage was punished with imprisonment. Then a woman takes a blow from one of the guards. Jiao suggests that Jiang keep quiet to avoid unnecessary trouble. The protagonist, irritated, asks why the guard hadn't been shot yet, but Jiao tells him to stay out of it, as that man was the inspector responsible for removing the bodies from the streets. Thus, he would quickly get used to it. She mentions that the inner circle of 6th Street was cleaner, but it cost 1 unit of energy to enter. However, since they came to that place to trade a few things at the market, that should be enough. Although the outer market was dirty, it was still better than the ghetto. In that place, thieves and other criminals were killed and their bodies dumped in trash bins. And at night, inspectors would drag their bodies to the farm to mix them with the fat collected earlier, turning them into fertilizer. However, the most notorious criminals were impaled on stakes to serve as examples, so others wouldn't commit crimes. Sometime later, a man seems to be eyeing a woman's breasts, mentioning that they were extremely beautiful. That's why he guarantees they are high-quality products, and there's nothing wrong with them. So 50 crystals wouldn't be too high a price for them. Next, a young man seems to close the deal with another man. As he leaves, he asks the young man to ensure he continues bringing high-quality products. Irritated, Jiao observes the situation, mentioning that they were heading to the New Ray Hotel, and that place was a house of lust offering all kinds of services to its guests. Moreover, she had heard a man grumbling that the girls in that place were quite soft. However, they were soft in the sense of devouring. As for that merchant, he was probably the suppression force that imprisoned the people from Shelter 101. Jiang asks what exactly those shelters were. The girl replies that they were quite peculiar, as each shelter had its own unique philosophy of life. However, they all had the same goal, which was to maximize their survival rate. Jiao had been born in Shelter 071, and thinking back, she was quite lucky. However, the other shelters weren't as lucky as hers. Furthermore, she had heard that the philosophy of Shelter 70 was to rule men with men, which led people to sanctify the leader. With that philosophy, the shelter turned into hell after 10 years, and the model of that virtue abandoned all modesty and became a dictator. Apparently, he used the security system to get rid of all the men, keeping only the women for his use. As for Shelter 101, it was an uninhabited shelter, and obviously, it had some use as it stored the DNA of the world's former elites. In the end, the tank embryo war was activated, and only God knew the utility of that bunch of artificial products that came out of the incubator. That's why perhaps the pre-war planners had already predicted that these things would be quite useful in the wasteland. Observing the situation, Jang thinks that this was truly the end of humanity. Meanwhile, a robot says is a mere Type 2 Den robot, powered by crystals, working on 6th Street in the wasteland. Its job was to assess the prices of goods unnecessary for that field, and the concept of irritation didn't exist in its programming. However, it had to evaluate the objects humans brought every day, such as metal scraps and composite bodies, among others. Then the protagonist appears, mentioning that he would like to sell something. The robot, in turn, says that for a second, it thought its processor had malfunctioned because its scanning system indicated that the item was radiation-free, and that it was a can of food with its contents intact, containing what pre-war humans called fresh steak. It asks if the boy happened to have similar products. Upon hearing that he had several of them, the robot asks him to follow it to the VIP room to receive his payment, as a dealer should be assigned to serve him. Shortly after, the protagonist encounters a rather friendly girl who welcomes him. Additionally, she says it's a pleasure to serve him, asking the boy to enter the room. Looking back, the protagonist assumes that this was a tea room. Right after, the girl seems to kneel down. Meanwhile, Jiao observed the girl, who eventually appears to be concerned about what was happening. Irritated, Jiao mentions that she had only earned 50 crystals per can of food, and that they could trick the protagonist as it wasn't just food, it was a luxury item. And if they offered it to the rich in the inner circle, they could easily get double the value. Jang thinks that the food was worthless to him, as he just wanted some crystals to recharge his tattoo, at least up to 30%. The girl, in turn, asks if the protagonist knew what kind of place that VIP room was. Jang asks if it wasn't a place to trade high-value items. Quickly, the girl asks him to come closer, saying she would tell him later, whispering in his ear that the place offered special services if he knew what she meant, and that if she weren't with the protagonist, the girl probably would have given the full service. Jiang asks why she preferred things that way when it was much better to choose the girl over the alternative. Quickly, Jiang seems to realize something and asks the boy not to look and pretend nothing happened. Then she sneakily kisses the protagonist and says that no one would dare cause trouble in that place, asking him to leave it to her as she had her way of dealing with rats of that kind. That way, they wouldn't be noticed if they pretended to be lovebirds, asking him not to look back and just keep walking because they'd shake them off when they reached the next joint. Meanwhile, a doctor seems to be analyzing the protagonist's arm, asking for payment as soon as possible. Looking at his hand, Jiang asks if that was all, and Joe mentions that now they just had to wait, because at that moment, they were going to buy ammunition for their weapons at the gun store. Moreover, they would spend the night in that place as it was full of terrors. Besides, there was plenty of opportunity for him. Some time later, Jiang seems to be eating something, asking if it was okay to do so, and the girl says that on the streets, the wealthiest residents or millionaires had the right to shoot anyone who entered their rooms without permission in the head without even asking for their name. So Jiang asks why they didn't get rid of him after dinner. Quickly, the girl points a gun at the boy, who becomes desperate, mentioning that he had mistaken him for someone else and had no intention of doing that. Giving the man a slap, Jiao asks who had sent the boy. Observing the situation, Jiang thinks no one would imagine that woman could become so terrifying when she was serious. And to understand the whole situation, they need to rewind the tape half an hour back, because he didn't imagine they'd have anti-aircraft trucks installed in the hotel's testing grounds in that world. That's why he ended up needing another canned fruit to recover from the shock. The desperate man says he didn't know anything and that what they were doing to him was illegal, and the 6th Street guards would arrest them. Joe says she doesn't have time for this nonsense, so she'll get straight to the point, asking how the refugee expected to prosper on 6th Street with those clothes, telling him she captured him because she saw him following them and ended up discovering she was absolutely right. Pointing a gun at the boy's private parts, the woman says they'd speed things up a bit, so she'd blow off one of his balls every 10 seconds. Desperate, the boy says he knows nothing and begs to be let go. Quickly, the protagonist appears, saying he wasn't a fan of resolving things in the smelly village. However, if he didn't stop pretending, maybe he should give some ideas to his assistant. But obviously, he'd much prefer to make a deal than resort to violence. After all, he was a businessman. So if he was willing to cooperate, that item would be all his. But of course, he could choose to lie too. However, he wouldn't do that if he were a man, because he doubted his boss would be more generous than the protagonist if he worked for him. Quickly, the boy says the cause of all that was the Ash mercenary group. Jiang asks if the girl had heard of that group before. The woman mentions that yes, a little, because they were involved in human trafficking and looted survivors, occasionally offering protection to some groups of clients. Then the man asks where to begin, warning that it all started at the pawn shop. Then, a flashback of two men appears, and the man with green hair mentions that he had found a walking crystal mine, so they should go right away as they had a job to do, ordering them to head to the back of that shop. The other guy asks what had happened and if he had found another little lamb. The young man says that was exactly it, but they would have to wait and see if it was really good. Quickly, that person starts approaching. Then it's revealed that it was the protagonist along with his friend. The man tells them to wait a little longer, as it could just be a spoiled rich boy coming to try something out. However, the woman beside him smelled like trouble, so they should wait a bit more as it wouldn't be worth dying because of her. He questions where his informant was as he hadn't seen him yet. He orders the other man to go call him while keeping an eye on the two, thinking that once everything was confirmed, it just needed to keep watch on them. However, at the same moment, he seems surprised by something. As he continues watching them, the man realizes they were heading to a vaccination clinic. Shortly after, he notices they started moving again. Additionally, they had gone to buy more ammunition, so it seemed they needed to be more cautious with them. Soon after, that man from earlier appears, calling the young man. The man with green hair asks if he was seeing those two in the gun store, ordering him to keep an eye on them and alert him when they leave the city. And if he did a great job, he received 5 units. The other man asks if they were 5 lambs for slaughter. The man says it was something like that as they first visited the vaccination clinic and then went to the gun store to buy ammunition and explosives. But no group would trade crystals for ammunition, and that's why everyone was already in the production line. So those two were just fools trying their luck in that land. That's why they should catch them quickly before anyone else got to them. The man says he already knew everything the young man had told him, so he should exchange that crystal right away. Surprised that it was only 100 energy units. 1 unit could be exchanged for 10 bottles of nutrient solutions. However, if he spent recklessly, he could live well for an entire month. At the same moment, someone seems to point a gun at the young man, executing the poor guy. Zhao, observing the situation, becomes nervous as someone had just been killed. Zhao, on the other hand, mentions that those stains were a pain to get out of her clothes. Besides, she could leave that kind of work to herself. Jiang mentions he needed to get used to that. Then, sitting on the protagonist's lap, the woman asks if he was going to stay. And the protagonist, in turn, asks if the girl already knew everything. She responds that women are quite sensitive. Hugging the boy, she asks him not to leave her. However, for the boy, he could never do that. Thinking that he had already made up his mind that night and admitted he initially just planned to take the gold and return to his world to live like a millionaire. But it seemed now he wouldn't be able to completely detach himself from that world, so he couldn't just leave and go back. That's why he would find a way to take her with him, because no one deserved to live in such a hellish world. Content, the girl says she would believe him. And the protagonist, all sneaky, says that if it weren't for the smell, he would grab the girl right away. She quickly mentions that if that's the case, she would take a bath right away. However, the protagonist at that moment didn't want to let go of her, and the girl asked him to carry her to the shower to see if the hygiene vaccine had made his muscles stronger. Inside the shower, the two start preparing for the bath, and those things that make you send the kids out of the room begin to happen. A while after they've had their fun, the woman is surprised that the vaccine had really worked. Meanwhile, the protagonist was admiring his six-pack, which had become perfect. Zhao, in turn, asks him to stop dreaming and get down to business. However, the protagonist asks to have dinner first. But first, they needed to dispose of the man's body, feeling awkward because he had done illicit things next to a dead man. And for that reason, he needed to control himself next time. Sometime later, a few people arrived to remove the body from the ground. Apologizing for the inconvenience and the lack of security in the hotel, they invite them to a restaurant offering a complimentary dinner from the hotel. Thanking them, Zhao mentions that they were already leaving, so the man could go. As they leave, the young man once again apologizes. Then Zhao says she wasn't interested in eating meat and beef anymore. Meanwhile, the protagonist seems to be preparing some food, asking if she wanted to ask about something like how he had pulled a bag of rice out of thin air. Zhao says she wasn't interested in that as Jiang wouldn't tell her anyway, and since she was hungry, she wanted to eat quickly. Soon after, the protagonist finishes making their dishes. Observing the table full of food, the girl is surprised. As she begins to eat, Zhao ends up loving the dishes. A while later, the protagonist is shocked because that pot had enough food for 3 days, yet it was devoured in just 1 meal. However, even after all that, Jiang still hadn't satisfied his hunger. He thought that the vaccine was really quite potent, and moreover, it seemed that her voracious appetite wasn't just because she was a big eater. The girl, in turn, asks what the protagonist is staring at since she really did eat a lot. Jiang jokes that if she kept eating like that, he wouldn't be able to continue feeding her. Embarrassed, the girl says that next time she'll try to eat less. However, Jiang was just teasing her. Irritated, she asks how he dared to make fun of her. The boy then takes her hand, saying that it didn't matter how much she ate, he would still be able to take care of her. Thinking that, thank God, he was smart enough to think fast, because he had almost gotten hit hard enough to lose his teeth. Zhao says that now that the boy had taken the vaccine, she wouldn't need to hold back when she kicked him. The boy replies that he'd clean up the mess, asking to stop talking and go to sleep already. Lying in bed, Zhao says that the commercial bank building was located in a district that was once quite prosperous. That's why there would be a lot of zombies and the radiation levels would be extremely high. In addition, several dangerous species often roam the area, and if they wanted to get gold, they'd have to go through a specific spot. Looking at a corner of the building's projection, the protagonist asks what that was. The girl responds that it was a holographic computer, and that it wasn't as reliable as a regular computer. Its performance was much better. Jang, in turn, asks if those species were really dangerous. She replies that they weren't like the flesh mountains from that morning. They were protected by body armor, so regular bullets wouldn't cause fatal wounds. The best thing to do when encountering one was to run. Even so, those things usually stayed in areas hit by nuclear bombs and only occasionally came out to search for food. So, they had two options. The first was to infiltrate the underground and blow up the vault with explosives. The second was to go to the control room and hack the server to gain access. Surprised, Jiang asks how the girl knew all that information and if it was really reliable. The girl responds that she had learned it in the city of Liuding, where they had a database with the most accurate maps. And apparently, that one had been downloaded directly from a satellite. Furthermore, she mentions that the city she kept talking about was located on an aircraft carrier, saying it was time for the protagonist to make his decision. Jiang says that the first option was too dangerous, as blowing up the vault would make a lot of noise. As for the second option, the boy asks if Jio knew how to hack. The girl responds that she could mess with the server right in front of him, but then she says she was just joking, as she didn't have that kind of skill, because all she needed to survive in the wasteland was good marksmanship. However, there were plenty of specialists for that, and since everyone was broke, it wouldn't cost much to hire someone. Jiang, in turn, says he'll hire someone with that skill, so the boy decides to go with the second plan and hire someone. Joe asks if he wasn't worried about the Ash mercenary company. Even though they hadn't acted yet, they had killed their men. The boy says she was right and felt that they'd act as soon as they left that area. Jiang then begins whispering in the girl's ear, saying they could do it that way. Jiao says the boy was tougher than she thought, so they should find someone the next day. Then, Jiang says it would be good to split up for a change, and she should try not to show up too much outside. However, the girl had already picked fights with a lot of outsiders, and a mercenary team was nothing to her. That's why, if she weren't worried about the protagonist, she would have left that area long ago. Irritated, the boy thinks that he too could leave that place whenever he wanted. Sometime later, the protagonist is outside, thinking that the wasteland's climate was very strange. Then, a man seems to hand something to the boy, asking if that's what he wanted. Jiang mentions that he had asked for a computer specialist, yet the man was offering him a former president. Thinking that it seemed like company owners and canned goods had high status in that world, Jiang realized it would save him effort every time he took a can out of production. Shortly after, the man returns, mentioning that everything was almost ready. He explains that producing bullets and other daily activities didn't require much technology, so many computer specialists were sold around there. Showing Jiang a paper, he asks if any of the specialists listed were to his liking, to which Jiang responds that a few of them seemed decent. Jiang then asks why the man had only offered criminals. The man explains that most refugees didn't have freedom, and that those who lived in the ghetto and couldn't sustain themselves became property of 6th Street, which was still a somewhat humane place. So those who were sold were either incapable or criminals. However, the man assures him not to worry, as all those sold wore electronic collars, and if they tried anything, they would end up hurting themselves. Observing the situation, the protagonist thinks he has no choice. One of them will have to do, but he'll have to be cautious. Right after, the man seems to point a gun at someone, saying he would shoot. At that moment, a blue-eyed girl suddenly hugs the protagonist. The man apologizes, explaining that she was a refugee who had escaped. The little girl apologizes for eavesdropping, but says she knows computers, begging Jiang to buy her. Soon after, the man leads the girl away. The other man asks if the protagonist is okay, and Jiang quickly asks what will happen to the girl. The man responds that she will be sent to a battlefield. However, Jiang questions whether a girl so young could work like that. The man explains that she's not as young as she looks, as they only place collars on those over 16 years old, and the girl hadn't grown yet. At that moment, Jiang decides he'll take the girl. He thinks she won't survive long in the field with that small body. She'd likely die in a few days. The man comments that the protagonist seemed to like young girls and that there were thousands of options like her, so he could easily get more. Irritated, the protagonist says the man talks too much, and the man, apparently afraid, quickly apologizes. Jiang says he'll let it slide, asking how long it will take to take her. The man replies that it will take a day and asks for Jiang's address. Jiang offers 2 crystals to speed up the process. The man says it's a legal process, but Jiang increases the offer to 3 crystals to get his point across. Quickly, the man says he'll handle everything right away, asking for just a minute. Jiang thinks that being authoritarian felt quite powerful in that moment. Shortly after, the man says the girl has already arrived and that everything is ready. All that's left is to sign for the process to be complete. However, the physical exams take some time, but that's for her own safety, so Jiang should try to understand. But he assures Jiang that based on the exam, her package hadn't been opened yet. Then Jiang signs a document, and the man says he'll personally escort him to ensure nothing happens, as it would be an honor to serve him again. Jiang then asks for the girl's name, and the man responds that her name is Yahello. Quickly, the protagonist asks if she's skilled in computers. She says yes, explaining that she got a B in the computer education subject of the virtual system and has solid knowledge in programming and hacking. Laughing, the protagonist asks why she's still in such a situation then. Yahello explains that many people there didn't even know what to do, and while she wasn't the best, she still had potential, so she wouldn't be a bad deal. Soon after, John grabs a jacket and hands it to her, telling her not to worry because he didn't want her to catch a cold, as it wasn't easy to get treatment in that place. So they should leave quickly, as they had many things to do. As they head out, Jiang mentions that he'll introduce her to his sister. A while later, Jiang is already home, and Joe asks if the protagonist has a fetish for young girls. Jiang replies that he figured she would say that, but assures her that Yahello is an incredible hacker. Joe then asks if she can be trusted. He responds that Yahello likely has nothing to do with the Ash mercenary company. Jiao says she doesn't trust a word of it, as it's a matter of her own security. Shortly after, Jiao seems to scrutinize Yahello, asking if she knows a man named Zhao, to which Yahello quickly responds that she doesn't know anything. Quickly, Jiao says she's going to check the child and hopes Jiang doesn't mind, mentioning that she's just investigating her body to see if she's trustworthy. She teases Jiang, asking why his face is turning red. With a mischievous look, the boy says he'll also check things out. A while later, the protagonist seems to be staring at the horizon with a bump on his head, realizing that the girl didn't have any transmitter or anything similar on her. He wonders if she's really a girl, and if so, why she has so few resources. Soon after, Jiao hands some clothes to the girl, who starts putting them on. Jiao, on her end, asks why the protagonist is so embarrassed, reminding him that she's now his personal property. And even if he did something, she couldn't resist anyway. The boy, in turn, asks if Jiao isn't going to get jealous, to which she quickly responds no, saying that she should just squeeze him dry. Jiang says they should stop talking and get to what really matters. Introducing the girl, he says her name is Jiao, and the protagonist says his name is Jiang, telling the girl she's now one of them. Moreover, she didn't need to call him master and should just call him Jiang, adding that the collar she was wearing wasn't safe for her, because he already trusted her. However, the girl quickly says she doesn't want the collar removed, appearing scared by what the boy was about to do. Confused, Jiang asks what happened. The girl says it's not that she doesn't like having such a kind master, but another woman had told her that she was very blessed to have been chosen, and so she shouldn't be abandoned. Jiang assures her he would never do that, but the girl responds that concern isn't the same as trust. Jiang realizes the girl is sharper than expected, as in that world, people point guns at their own siblings and betray their wives and children. That's why she thought he'd stop trusting her the moment he removed her collar. Observing the situation, the protagonist thinks she's right, as it's natural for people to be unpredictable in a world like this. The girl says that if she can earn the protagonist's trust while still wearing the collar, that would be enough. As long as she's obedient, she won't be abandoned. She adds that she has no ambitions and only desires to keep surviving, but of course, she wouldn't mind being more blessed than she already is. Jiang places his hand on the girl's head, assuring her she'll definitely be blessed in the future, and says it's already late, so she should go take a bath. As she leaves, the protagonist thinks that those girls see him as someone who thinks differently in the apocalypse. In their eyes, he must seem so kind, almost like a child. He also reflects that not being a ruthless man in that world is very uncommon. However, he wonders if, one day, they all go to a peaceful world, will they still feel fear? A while later, the two girls seem to be taking a bath together. Jiao tells the younger girl not to be nervous, saying she's not as mean as the others in her group. She mentions how soft the girl's skin has become after being cleaned, and the girl responds that it's because of the Sleep Mode 3 capsule, which improves the body's condition. Jiao remarks that it's a pretty extravagant toy, asking if the girl is older than her. The girl quickly clarifies that's not the case. She explains that she entered the sleep capsule when she was 12, and after spending around 20 years in it, her body has only aged by 2 years thanks to the vaccine's effects. Adding the 2 years she spent on 6th Street, the doctor told her that her body is now like that of a 16-year-old, but her mental age is around 14. Jiao laughs and says if you add 12 plus 20, that would make her 32, which irritates the girl, who insists she's not that old. The girl then starts laughing at Jiao, saying they should dive into the water. Soon, a playful commotion breaks out in the bathroom. Jiang feels happy, thinking he never imagined those two would get along so well so quickly. Shortly after, Jiao leaves the bathroom wearing only a towel, telling the younger girl to come out too. Sitting in a chair, she remarks how great it feels to take a bath. The protagonist, in turn, asks her to at least put some clothes on before eating. Sipping a drink, Jiao comments on how good it is, calling the younger girl to join them, who responds that she just needs to put on her clothes first. A while later, the protagonist asks the girl to sit down and eat with them. As she looks at the abundance of food on the table, the girl wonders if she's dreaming. Quickly, she bites her hand, realizing that everything is indeed real. Jiang tells her to start eating, or Jiao would finish everything quickly. With tears in her eyes, the girl asks if she can really eat. Jiang responds that she can eat whenever she wants, while he argues with Jiao to eat more slowly. Sitting at the table, the girl, still with tears in her eyes, feels happy as the atmosphere reminds her of something familiar. She ponders the meaning of happiness as everyone has their own definition of it. The city is quiet, but soon after, the silence is broken by an explosion. Jiang Chen flees carrying the girl in his arms. Sun Jiao calls for him to follow her. Soldiers begin shooting from the rooftops. A man says that his fat lamb had escaped and orders Team 2 to take action. He then questions how the three of them had uncovered his scheme. Irritated, he orders his men to act, warning that if they mess up, the boss will be furious. As they run, Jiang Chen asks Sun Jiao if they still have a long way to go. Sun Jiao replies that they're almost there. She then leaps, saying that they've reached the block of buildings. While fleeing, Jiang Chen admits that Sun Jiao had more courage than many men. He thinks that things had gotten out of control, but they were still going according to plan. Earlier that day, a man was selling a product to the group. The protagonist says that he'll take the holographic computer and some spare parts. Shortly after, the vendor calculates the total and says the purchase will cost 20 energy units. The group leaves the shop. However, they're being watched. Jiang Chen wonders if they've been discovered and comments that his gene injection didn't just increase his appetite. Sun Jiao tells him to ignore them and stick to the plan. She explains that the crossing is just ahead, a place easy to get cornered, so they need to be cautious, and lets her check it out first. As she surveys the area, she notices that it's too quiet. From the rooftops, the men watch everything silently. Sun Jiao detects the ambush and says it looks like they wanted a smooth journey. She then tells the protagonist to grab Yeo and run when she gives the signal. The group stops to rest. Jiang Chen thinks that carrying someone still felt heavy even with a gene injection. Sun Jiao tells him to prepare for a fight and asks if he can still fight. The boy replies that he's fine. As he gets up, he asks if they couldn't just burn them alive, but Sun Jiao tells him to relax, saying that they're after his money, so they'd be careful. Then she says that they're coming. One of the bandits thinks that his boss had given the order to watch two fat lambs. Even though they've been fleeing, they managed to track them down. But it's obvious the couple had received gene injections. Not even their boss could afford gene injections. He concludes that the two will be captured soon since they've holed up in the building. However, one of the men is shot in the head. In the building, Jiang Chen and Sun Jiao are shooting at the bandits. The protagonist laughs, saying that they'll all die. But Sun Jiao advises him to aim before firing. The boy apologizes, saying it's a habit from playing PUBG. Meanwhile, Yao hides, scared. Then Sun Jiao says she'll show him how to shoot properly. The bandit leader says they won't be able to advance if things continue like this and asks where the reinforcements are. Soon after, an armored vehicle arrives. A man uses the vehicle's machine gun to fire at them. Sun Jiao says that's not good and tells Jiang Chen to follow the plan and retreat first. The boy, in turn, tells her to be careful. The girl dodges the shots from the armored vehicle. The man orders the gunner to stop firing as the boy had escaped and they wouldn't be able to hit the girl from there, so they should move in and find her. The gunner taunts the girl, telling her to come out and have some fun. However, the man is shot in the throat. The gunfire erupts again. Then Sun Jiao throws a grenade at the bandits. She uses the distraction to make her escape. In the tunnel, Jiang Chen tells Yeo to jump, promising to catch her. The girl jumps and the boy catches her. He then asks if Sun Jiao will be okay. As Jiang sets Yeo down, he reassures her that Sun Jiao would be fine. After all, she was the woman who had captured him in an instant while they were talking. Yeo notices that they are in a drainage system. Jiang Chen explains that he discovered this place while looking at the map and noticed an entrance in the building that led directly to the drainage system. The entrance was sealed, but Sun Jiao had managed to clear the obstacles. Shortly after, Sun Jiao falls into Jiang's arms. He jokingly asks if she wasn't afraid of hitting her head jumping like that. But Sun Jiao responds that she knew he would catch her. The bandit leader asks where she went and orders his men to search everywhere for her. Sun Jiao tells Jiang to stop moving, assuring him they won't be able to catch them. She then tells him it's time to let go, because she had already planned a bomb up top. And now all that was left was to press the button. Jiang Chen hesitates, unsure if he should kill those bandits, but he had no reason to sympathize with them. One of the men says he found something. The bandit leader declares that they'll have their fun with the woman once they catch her. However, the entrance to the tunnel is locked from the inside. The man figures the group must have hidden underground and orders someone to bring the chainsaw. But soon, the bombs Sun Jiao planted in the building start beeping. Jiang Chen presses the button, and the entire building explodes. As they walk through the tunnel, Sun Jiao asks if Jiang is afraid of walking in the dark. The protagonist replies that he hadn't been afraid of the mercenaries, so there's no reason to fear this place. Jiang Chen then comments that when the mercenary company finds out they killed some of their group, they'll definitely seek revenge. Sun Jiao says they might try to attack them on 6th Street if they appear there. But that doesn't matter anymore as they have other places to trade, and it wouldn't be difficult to wipe out the mercenary company either. Jiang Chen thinks he's gotten involved with a violent maniac. Yeo looks behind her, startled by something passing near her. The protagonist calms her down, telling her she doesn't need to be afraid, and as long as she stays close, everything will be fine, and he'll protect her. Sun Jiao laughs, asking how many bandits the boy has killed so far. The boy responds, thinking he's killed 2. Sun Jiao teases him, saying he's lying and at most only injured too. Jiang Chen retorts that it's all the same, as what matters is making them unable to walk. Yao smiles at the situation. The boy then says he didn't expect the tunnel to be so sturdy. In his city, the construction would have collapsed after such an explosion. Sun Jiao explains that the government had invested heavily in foundations before the war. She mentions that the exit should be near. The protagonist wonders why his heart is beating so fast. He thinks it would be best to leave this place quickly. He asks Yao to stay behind him. Shortly after, shots are fired at the group, but Sun Jiao manages to save them. However, she gets hit in the arm by one of the bullets. While bleeding, she tells Jiang Chen to be more careful, as there are people living down here. The protagonist is shocked, realizing that Sun Jiao got hurt because of him. Sun Jiao then tells him and Yao to flee while she handles the situation. The creatures start advancing, but Jiang Chen, angry, tells Sun Jiao that he'll never abandon her. As he begins slaughtering the creatures, he reflects on how he can't even protect his woman. He pulls out his gun and shoots at the creatures, declaring that for hurting his woman, he will kill them all. Sun Jiao warns that this isn't good, as his life will be in danger if he keeps this up. Jiang Chen continues killing the monsters with just his hands. Sun Jiao tells Yao to go after Jiang as he's in a very dangerous condition. After defeating all the creatures, Jiang Chen staggers, but one of the monsters is still alive. It grabs the boy's leg. Then the monster charges at him with a knife. The creature manages to stab the protagonist in the chest, but before it can do more harm, Yao shoots it. Before Jiang can talk to the girl, he collapses and loses consciousness. The next day, Jiang Chen wakes up. He wonders what happened and why he can't remember anything. Yao enters the room with a bowl of water and asks Jiang to wash his face first. Sun Jiao asks if he's feeling better. The protagonist responds that he's fine, but before anything else, he suggests they have breakfast. The last thing he remembers is being hunted by the mercenary forces, entering the drainage system, and then seeing a place filled with corpses. Jiang Chen could still smell it. He still expected the underground of that world to be full of panic and death. Sun Jiao tells him to stop thinking about it, explaining that they were all cannibals. She adds that they were enemies of humanity and even mutants despise them. The protagonist says he thinks he'll need to be away for a while, maybe for a month, as he needs to replenish his food supplies. Sun Jiao says it's fine but tells him to come back soon. Jiang Chen smiles and says that for now, they should enjoy breakfast. While they wash the dishes, Sun Jiao tells Jiang that he had been driven by anger and entered a rage state. The drugs only modify the body's 3 basic abilities. That's only true when the DNA is normal. Sometimes unexpected mutations occur, and she had heard of people who gained extra heads after the injections. Jiang Chen is shocked, realizing he had taken something so dangerous. But Sun Jiao assures him that the probability of something bad happening is so low it's not worth worrying about. However, some people acquire benign mutations that grant useful abilities. She then shows her gunshot wounds, which had already healed because she has the resilience ability. Sun Jiao explains that if she uses the ability too much, she becomes extremely weak. It's the same with Jiang's ability. She recommends that he only use it sparingly as it consumes a lot of vital energy, and he should use his EP for a more detailed explanation. When they read the description of his ability, they discover it's triggered by a spike in emotion that causes the body's cells to disrupt metabolism. Sun Jiao says that in a safe environment, it's fine to use it. But there are too many variables in a battlefield. Jiang Chen thinks that if Yao hadn't arrived when she did, he probably would have died. Sun Jiao explains that abilities can be controlled with practice, and after training, he'll be able to activate and deactivate it at will. She then hands him something and tells him to equip it on his EP, explaining that when he wants to activate his rage, he should press the button, and the drug will be injected. But she advises him not to rely too much on the ability. As Jiang packs the gold in his bag, he tells them he'll be back soon. He adds that there's food in the freezer that should last at least 6 months. Meanwhile, the younger girl seems to be training. The protagonist watches her and comments on her hair, and the girl explains that Joe helped her last night and fixed her hair. Jiang is surprised to learn that Joe knows how to cut hair. He mentions that they should remember to eat fresh vegetables too, as they shouldn't rely solely on canned food. At that moment, the girl asks the protagonist to wait. Joe then gives Jiang a kiss, teasing him to say something romantic this time. Meanwhile, the younger girl is sad, not wanting the protagonist to leave. Quickly, she gives Jiang a kiss too, surprising him with her bold move. Noticing Joe's irritation, Jiang says they can't blame him for that. The younger girl asks him to return soon, and he promises he'll be back in a few days. As he leaves the house, the protagonist tells them they don't need to watch him leave. A while later, Jiang has already returned home. He notes that it was almost 11 when he left, and it seems the time the post-apocalyptic world was syncing with this world's time. Additionally, with all the gunfire and chaos, he could have suffered serious mental damage if he had stayed there much longer. But now he can finally hear the noise again, or rather, a nostalgic sound. Thinking that the civilized world is better, he celebrates the peaceful world. However, he quickly gets out of bed, realizing he still has things to do like weighing the gold bars. His dream had come true, and now he's feeling very nervous. Weighing the gold, he discovers it amounts to 35 kilograms. He's astonished by how much money he'll be able to make. Jiang pondered what he would do with so much money, wondering if it would be enough to buy a car and a house or perhaps much more. And if he were to settle down, he dreamed of owning a luxurious mansion. After all, he still had a bank full of gold waiting for him. But there was still a lot of gold left in that place, so he'd have to return to collect more. Moreover, his girlfriend was still there waiting for him, along with the other girl. Thinking about all of this, he realized there was no point in overthinking things. He should just enjoy life. For now, he needed to eat something and enjoy a hearty meal. After all, he would need a lot of energy to sell all that gold. And if he wanted to live in style, he dreamed of having a luxurious mansion along with a very nice car. He could make that happen because there was still a bank full of gold waiting for him. So he used the money to gather some courage and return later. But for now, all he could do was enjoy the small pleasures of life and relax before taking the next step. Shortly after, the protagonist pulled something from his pocket. He revealed it to be a state-of-the-art holographic pen, saying they should kill time with it. Remembering what a vendor had said, he noted that it was loaded with hundreds of movies, only the best. So they should make good use of this futuristic technology, as he had always wanted to watch a movie in a hologram. Soon, the loud sounds of a movie began to play. The protagonist was completely embarrassed by the content, mentioning how loud it was. He realized the movies were rather peculiar and understood why the vendor had such a depraved look. Besides, if this had been in his past, he would have eagerly watched those films. But now he considered himself an evolved person, no longer the same virgin otaku, and no longer interested in such things. As the protagonist walked, he reflected on how everything felt so nostalgic, especially compared to the ruined world he had just left. Everything here was colorful and bright. He thought he needed to relax a bit because if he kept pushing himself, he might end up losing his mind. Looking to the side, he spotted a cicada. He remarked how long it had been since he'd seen one, finally encountering normal creatures again. Because the cockroaches in the other world were shockingly huge, larger than dogs. He wondered if the cicadas there were the same size. If he could turn this gold into cash, he could forget about the banks. But without proof of purchase, he might end up getting arrested, so perhaps a gold shop would be the best choice. He needed to find one that wouldn't cause trouble, so he decided to try the shop right in front of him. He entered the store. A sales girl approached him, asking if he was there to pick out a ring for his girlfriend, mentioning that they had a wide variety. Quickly, the protagonist asked if they accepted gold. The girl replied that they did, but only if it had a purity of 99% or higher, so he would need to bring something of high quality. The protagonist then asked for the manager to come down, as this negotiation was beyond her. The woman left, thinking it was hard to believe the protagonist was trying to negotiate so much gold, especially with the clothes he was wearing and the backpack full of gold. A while later, the manager arrived. He was surprised by the amount of gold in the boy's backpack. He asked the protagonist for his name and invited him to follow him. After inspecting the contents, the manager announced that the total weight was 7,122 grams, and based on its color, it was definitely high-quality gold. Additionally, there were no issues with it. The manager then asked if Jiang had any money. Jiang replied that he didn't. The manager then asked the other employee to leave the room. He noted that the gold was quite different and questioned its origin. Jiang reassured him, explaining that the bars were registered in another country and that the source was legitimate, as it had been a form of payment. The manager was surprised, commenting that Jiang must be quite high-ranking mercenary to be paid in gold. In all his 20 years of experience, he had never seen anyone bring in so much gold in such a small backpack. Quickly, Jiang asked if the manager wanted to make a deal. The manager said he was interested but suggested they not rush things, because if the gold didn't have paperwork, it could complicate matters for them. Jiang then calculated the amount of gold he would receive. He mentioned that whatever remained could go to the manager, asking what he thought of the offer, as the current gold rate was 270 yuan per gram. The manager replied that if that were the case, he'd have no choice but to accept the deal, asking if Jiang wanted to be paid in cash or via bank deposit. A while later, everything was done and Jiang checked his bank account to confirm the money had been deposited without issue. As he was about to leave, the manager told him to take care. The manager handed Jiang his personal card, expressing hopes of doing business with him again. Jiang thought to himself that once someone becomes rich, they truly become everyone's boss. Who would have thought that the manager of such a fancy shop would speak to him like that? Meanwhile, the manager wondered if he should send someone to follow the boy, because anyone who sells gold so casually like that usually has a lot more stashed away. But he decided to observe for now and deal with it later. While in the taxi, the driver asked Jiang what he planned to do with all that money. Jiang thought about how rich he was going to be and how he was about to climb the ladder of success. Laughing, the driver said the boy must be thinking he was rich just because he paid the fare with 20 rias. Shortly after, the driver announced they had arrived at Jiang's destination. The protagonist, feeling like a real boss, handed over a bill and told the driver to keep the change. Jumping with joy, Jiang mentioned how he'd always wanted to say that. The driver, amused, commented that he liked seeing rich kids get excited over such things. As Jiang walked, he thought about needing new clothes, and since his intention was to stand out, it was essential not only to impress girls but also to be presentable for business deals, but it was better to wear expensive clothes. Returning to the same store he visited earlier, the boy declared that this time he wasn't a worker, he was a customer. He figured there was no better place to show off than the store where he used to work. He wanted to see the expression of the jerk who had fired him. Now that he was there, he would only buy the most expensive clothes. However, he noticed something strange but decided to ignore it, focusing on picking his outfits. Meanwhile, a sales girl watched him, surprised that he didn't hesitate when he saw the prices. She noticed that despite his youth, he had a confident, regal posture. Helping the protagonist, the girl wondered if her attempt at seduction might work. At the checkout, Jiang asked them to total up the clothes, excluding those he didn't pick. He wanted everything left in stock. Thinking it must be a joke given how expensive the clothes were, the sales girl asked if this was some kind of prank. Jiang assured her it wasn't. It was real. He said he would pay with a card and started looking for another employee. He explained that he used to work there, needing to make money for college. But today he was there to flaunt his wealth, adding that he only came back to make a certain woman suffer. It wasn't because he was a bad person, but because that woman had made his life difficult while he worked there. Meanwhile, the saleswoman was still packing up his clothes. Jiang asked where the manager was. She responded that the manager had gone to the main office and wouldn't be back that day, asking if Jiang was dissatisfied with something. Jiang mentioned that manager Xia was an old acquaintance of his, and that's why he came looking to reminisce a little. However, the woman corrected him, saying her surname was Ku. Quickly changing the subject, Jiang tried to brush it off. The sales girl then remembered that the previous manager's surname was indeed Xia. Jiang then asked if she knew where the former manager was. She explained that the manager had been fired and then retrained at the main office, eventually becoming responsible for the place. Understanding the situation, Jiang said he would use the fitting room. He was thrilled with the news he had just received. Yet at the same time, he wondered why he felt an emptiness in his chest. He realized that the life he was leading had pulled him out of reality, affecting him subconsciously. Still, he decided to push it aside because he had more important things to take care of. A while later, Jiang left the store with his new clothes, telling them to give the rest to the homeless people who needed them. Shortly after, Jiang entered another place. He mentioned he didn't have an appointment, but still expected to find a spot for himself. He also made it clear that he didn't care about the price and requested the most expensive haircut they had. Soon after, Jiang was lying down while the woman told him to wait a bit, as they were calling their most skilled hairdresser. When the girl arrived, she greeted him with a polite good afternoon and introduced herself as Ju, saying it was a pleasure to meet him. Noticing how pretty she was, the protagonist thought she was an 8 out of 10. The girl, on the other hand, asked him to relax and inquired if he would like to listen to some music. Enjoying the experience, Jiang thought it was very relaxing, feeling his money was well spent. As she worked, the girl thought the man before her had quite a striking appearance. She was quickly smitten with the protagonist. Jiang, meanwhile, asked if the water wasn't too hot. Cooling it down, the girl apologized for the inconvenience. She then asked what kind of haircut he preferred, and Jiang replied that he wanted a more formal cut to match his current aura. A while later, after finishing, Jiang pulled out a gold card to pay. As he left the establishment, several girls admired his handsome appearance. Jiang reflected that walking around like that felt a bit lonely as his university friends had all returned to their hometowns. He figured he must be the only one left in the city. Maybe someone was still around, but it had been a long time since he had spoken to any of them. Looking to the side, he noticed a women's clothing store and wondered if he should pick something out for Jiao. However, he decided against it, thinking that a guy walking into a women's store and picking clothes might look odd. It would have been nice if Jiao was there with him. They could stroll around and do things together. They could live a happy life like any other couple, but for now, he didn't know how to bring other people along with his ability. Feeling a bit hungry, Jiang soon found himself in a restaurant enjoying a meal. After finishing, he paid with his card. Looking out at the beach, Jiang commented that he had walked all afternoon and was feeling a bit tired. He now understood why that place had become a tourist attraction in his city. In his 4 years of college, he had only managed to visit the coast once. His classmates would always tell exaggerated stories about the place, saying that girls there were stunningly beautiful. However, Jiang saw none of that. There was no one around. It was disappointing to have come so far for nothing. Out of the million he had obtained that morning, he had only spent 200,000, and so he realized he had become one of those wealthy people he always disliked. Still, you couldn't brag too much with just $1 million, not even enough to buy a house. Yet he had a vault full of gold, and the gold in that bank was worth less than $1 billion. The thought of it excited him, wondering if there was more in the post-apocalyptic worlds. However, selling too much gold would cause the price to drop, which could be a problem. The gold from the bank was already sufficient, and there were other ways to make money. For example, the holographic pen he had brought with him. He wondered if he could start a company, patent it, and sell it. If he could produce it on a large scale, its value could skyrocket to at least $100 billion. Other systems he had seen could also be useful to sell. But then he thought he should stop fantasizing and focus on one thing at a time. If such advanced technology was introduced all at once, it would attract the wrong kind of attention before he could even make his fortune. The best strategy now was to quietly grow his capital and get rich under the radar. it was better to leave the bigger plans for later and enjoy life with the money he had for now. Just then, a girl approached Jiang, asking if he wanted to have some fun. Judging by his clothes, she figured he was definitely rich, and since she was attractive, she thought she would easily charm a wealthy guy. Plus, Jiang was even more handsome than she had initially thought. Standing up from his seat, the protagonist thanked her, politely declining the offer, and suggested she save her youth for someone closer to her age. Besides, he mentioned his girlfriend was much more beautiful than her. The girl was left furious by his comment. As Jiang left the establishment, he thought to himself how ridiculous the situation had been, thinking anyone watching would think he was a fool. Realizing it was already night, Jiang decided it was time to head home. ChatGPT. Kaixia was an economics student specializing at the university, with good looks and undeniable talent. Many people began to admire her. After 4 years at university, she graduated with top marks, but due to family issues, she postponed her plans for further education. She chose to work at a clothing store. Thanks to her high-level skills, she quickly rose to the position of manager at the most prosperous store in the region, which provided her a prime opportunity to put her ambitions into practice. Her journey was similar to that of protagonists in novels. Once she reached her position, she implemented a series of measures that skyrocketed the store's sales to a new level. However, due to her strict management style, she earned the nickname Ice Lady. Despite her career achievements, there was also a rumor that she had a boyfriend who loved her dearly. Kaixia was always focused on the pinnacle of her career, so she never gave much attention to the boy. As a result, she became the subject of jokes among Jiang and his group, who teased that she must have a problem, always wearing an expression as if she had eaten something unpleasant. Eventually, the rumors reached Kaixia's ears, prompting her to investigate the situation and find the culprit. Thus, the protagonist suffered the consequences. By pointing out small faults gradually, Kaixia managed to push Jiang out of his job, where he had been employed for a year, leaving Jiang puzzled as to why. However, after a night of heavy drinking, he decided it wasn't worth dwelling on. He moved past the incident, recognizing that Kaixia, being in a management role, ran the store perfectly fine without a lowly worker like him. But the matter didn't end there. Skill and education were important factors, but for those around Kaixia, another aspect became significant: her unpopularity. More and more people refused to follow her management because being strict and tough might bring short-term success, but generated significant resentment in the long run. The job's high demands, combined with low pay, became less appealing. As dissatisfaction grew, the quality of the store's results began to suffer. Even though Kaixia was a top-notch employee, she ended up getting fired due to her lack of maturity in managing people. Thus, the powerful woman who had been considered an unreachable flower at the university found herself unexpectedly unemployed. Surprisingly, all of this happened within just a year. Although Kaixia was smart enough to realize where she had gone wrong, it was too late to fix things because she soon realized it was all related to the man she had fired, Jiang, since after that, everyone started treating her differently. As the saying goes, bad news never comes alone. Irritated, her boyfriend confessed that despite being with her all this time, she had never even let him kiss her, throwing his coffee in her face. Quickly after that, he started dating another woman, not even bothering to hide it. But that wasn't the end of her troubles. The man had also used Kaixia's name to borrow a large sum of money, which he used to buy a new car to pick up his new girlfriends every day. Kaixia had been giving him substantial amounts of money each month to pay off his debts, unaware of the situation until she became unemployed. That was when all of her problems came to light. In a populous country with plenty of talent, the saddest part was that the passenger seat of the car she had paid for was no longer hers. She thought about calling the police, but the loan wasn't official, and the other party wasn't exactly friendly, so she didn't want to provoke them. Left with no choice, she moved to a rundown apartment in a public housing complex, spending her days doing odd jobs and living in a decrepit home, hoping to save enough money to resolve her issues and one day find a respectable job. However, her luck ran out sooner than expected. One day, a man in a striped jacket knocked on her door, asking if a woman named Kaixia lived there. Looking her over, the man remarked that she seemed to be living a good life, before telling her to leave the place as he was going to take her for a little trip. As she left the apartment, she asked him to make it quick. The man commented that he hadn't expected to find her working part-time at a flower shop and asked if she had saved up enough money. Kaixia, in turn, replied that she was working to pay her debts and asked them to stop bothering her. Irritated, the man asked how much longer Kaixia thought they should wait and if she was joking with him, reminding her that she had two options: the money or herself. Annoyed, Kaixia asked if they were involved in prostitution. The man chuckled and said it would be a waste to put her into that, as she was far too beautiful. They planned to have some fun with her for a few years before selling her off to someone else. Faced with this situation, Kaixia went silent. The man remarked that he knew she was in a tough spot, but rules were rules, and this was a natural consequence for failing to pay her debts. He reassured her not to worry too much. She would just need to work in a brothel for a few years to pay off her debt, and after that, she could leave. Maybe even get married and leave the city, as long as she didn't take out more loans. Meanwhile, just 10 minutes earlier, the protagonist was walking in the darkness when he noticed a couple passing by him, wondering why he was so tense at this hour. Without the strength from his drug enhancements, he would have collapsed like a sack of potatoes. Glancing to the side, Jiang noticed a commotion and saw that it was none other than the manager who had once fired him. He approached the scene and asked the man what his name was, mentioning that they'd just come from the mountain tobacco shop and had high-quality stuff. He asked if they wanted a puff. The man, confused, asked who Jiang was. Jiang casually replied that he was just passing by, coincidentally noticing an old acquaintance. Xia glanced over, recognizing Jiang, wondering why he was there and what he was doing. Jiang, on the other hand, asked how much she owed the two men. He added that they shouldn't harass such a sensitive woman. It wasn't the behavior of a real man. The older man observed Jiang, remarking that he was bold and attempted to throw a punch at him. But within seconds, Jiang blocked the blow, telling him that things should be settled with words and asked what the man thought he was trying to do. Surprised, the man realized the boy had blocked his strike. He then attempted to stab Jiang, but the effort was futile, as Jiang easily caught the knife, claiming it as his own now. The man reached for a gun, but Jiang stopped him, suggesting they relocate to another alley where there might not be any cameras. Xia, watching the scene, thought Jiang wasn't in his right mind and wondered if he wasn't afraid. Quickly, the two men moved out of the area, and Jiang told Xia to wait. He'd be back shortly. Outside the alley, the group advanced on Jiang. In response, Jiang pulled out a gun, pointing out that there were no cameras there and asked if he should use his toy. The man scoffed, saying the gun wasn't real. In an instant, Jiang shot the other thug in the leg, proving the gun was very real. Now the man believed him. Desperate, the man ordered everyone to stop moving, asking if they could talk things through, as there was no need for more violence. Jiang said that's exactly what he had been suggesting earlier, but the man just wouldn't shut up. With the gun pointed at his head, the older man pleaded for calm. Quickly, Jiang asked if the man had any receipts or a bank account number for the debt. Handing over the paper, the man asked what Jiang was going to do, and Jiang replied that he was going to pay off the debt, leaving the man completely stunned. In short, Jiang wanted to buy Xia's debt. Seeing what the protagonist had just said, everyone seemed relieved. Within seconds, the transfer was complete, and the man thanked Jiang for what he had done. As everyone left, Jiang thought to himself that now he needed to stash this in his dimensional storage. Meanwhile, Xia, still waiting, wondered what was taking so long and if something had gone wrong. Seeing Jiang return, she asked if he was okay. Jiang asked if she had been hurt during the encounter. Xia mentioned that she would go get something to treat the wound, but Jiang dismissed it, saying it was nothing. He then told her there was no need to look at him like that. After all, he was now the owner of her debt. Besides, he added it was a good deal, though they had gone too easy on her. Jiang said he wasn't going to accept any kind of interest-based deal. The girl responded that she would pay what she owed, including the interest. At that moment, the man called out to the girl, telling her he really didn't want to anger other people, handing over half of his salary in advance, thinking it should be enough to settle his debts, and telling her not to come back. He then shut the door in her face. Jiang began to tease her. The girl thought about how she couldn't hold down a job for more than 15 days and would need to look for a new one the next day. Jiang asked where she was headed, and the girl responded that she was going home, waving goodbye to him once again. However, Jiang insisted he wanted to go to her house, as his wounds still hadn't healed. A little later, the two of them were near the girl's home. Looking around, the protagonist was surprised, as he hadn't known such old apartments still existed in the city, wondering how people managed to live there. Inside the girl's home, Jiang thought she must be quite tough. Any other person might have given up by now. He noted that she was very beautiful, and that if she stopped being so hard on herself, she could probably find a better job and man. But then he reminded himself not to judge others' homes too much, as he had once lived in a cheap apartment too. Apologizing, the girl told him she didn't have much to offer, but he could sit wherever he felt comfortable. It was the first time she had brought a man into her home. Jiang looked around and thought that despite how simple the place was, she still kept everything very clean. He noticed that the chairs were quite worn. Fetching some medicine, the girl asked where his wound was, as she had mentioned she was going to treat his injury, gathering some tools and moving closer to him. Feeling embarrassed, Jiang thought to himself that he wouldn't fall in love with her. The girl asked him not to move, and an awkward silence filled the room. She thanked him for what he had done that day. Jiang told her there was no need to thank him, he was just passing by. Hesitantly, the girl asked if he still hated her. Reflecting on it, he admitted that he still hated her a little. He explained that after she fired him, he nearly ended up on the street, even going hungry, and his favorite pastime was mentally cursing her. And even if he got revenge, it wouldn't change anything. He asked if she really thought he showed up just to laugh at her. Jiang thought that if he hadn't lost that job, he wouldn't have become an alcoholic and never would have been hit by that hyperdimensional bracelet. Sometimes, blessings really did come from curses. The girl said that after firing him, she reflected a lot and realized she wasn't a good manager. Jiang told her that she was certainly competent but didn't understand people's hearts. And that wasn't something you could learn from books. You could study your whole life and still never fully understand people. Looking down at the row, he noticed 3 pairs of shoes, thinking that if he remembered correctly, she still had a boyfriend. He remarked that it was getting late and asked if her boyfriend wouldn't get jealous. The girl fell silent. Jiang figured he didn't know the whole story, but her boyfriend must have taken so much money from her that it ruined her. That was probably why she was kicked out of her place. He cursed her boyfriend, saying he was a scumbag. However, the girl told him that her boyfriend was no longer in her life. Jiang asked why she had returned to her parents' home, as it would be better than living in that place, but she didn't want to burden her family with her problems. Jiang asked if she wanted to tell him her story. So Xia told him everything she had gone through since firing him, explaining how she had failed at managing the store, how people began to underestimate her abilities, how she lost her boyfriend, his betrayal, the threats, and everything else. She didn't want Jiang's sympathy, she just needed to vent because she was exhausted. That's why she was willing to talk to the first person who was ready to listen. Jiang told her she should do that more often, adding the smile that she was much more beautiful when she laughed. Blushing a little, the girl said that Jiang was quite interesting. She mentioned that she had finished her story, so now he could tell his. Jiang shrugged, saying there wasn't much to tell. He had just started a business and ended up making some money. No entanto. Xia said she didn't believe him. Jiang replied that he didn't care whether she believed him or not, but he thought she would make an excellent manager for his company and asked if she was interested. Thinking that this was serious, Xia found it hard to believe as it all seemed too unreal. Still, sooner or later, the truth would come out and there was no place for her to run. The best solution was to start a company and appoint someone as his manager. At the same time, Jiang could continue exploring the treasures from the future. Moreover, Xia was highly competent and incorruptible, making her the most trustworthy person he knew for such a role. Jiang asked how long she thought it would take to pay off her debt by working at a flower shop, especially since she was currently unemployed. He told her she should accept the job. Surprised, Xia asked if the protagonist had really started the company, meaning she would end up becoming his subordinate. Jiang then asked if she didn't like the idea, as he was really looking forward to seeing his former supervisor work for him. Xia hesitated, deep in thought. After a moment, she accepted his offer. Jiang welcomed her on board and hired her to manage the futuristic technology company, offering her a starting salary of 20,000 yuan. Xia was shocked at how much she would be earning. Jiang added that he wouldn't accept any additional rules imposed on him. With a mischievous look, he commented that the company didn't prohibit employees from trying to seduce the president, so she was free to do as she pleased. Hearing this, Xia became irritated. She demanded more information about this company. Jiang started rambling about various technological concepts, mixing in some embarrassing details. But then he quickly cut himself off, telling her to stop with the small talk. He explained that she would be the CEO and would handle everything. Besides, the company was still in its conceptual phase. He asked if Xia was excited since she could soon become one of China's richest people. Meanwhile, Xia seemed to be using her phone to call a mental health facility, saying there was a crazy person nearby. Jiang, asking her to hang up, told her to let him finish talking. He warned her that if she didn't join him now, she might regret it in 5 years. He reassured her that he was serious about making her the CEO of his company. At this stage, she would receive 20,000 yuan per month, and he said she didn't need to worry about her debt anymore because they could take care of that later. To start, he gave her her first task, to register the company with a reward of 500,000 yuan for doing so. After some time, her salary would increase to a much higher amount. Xia asked if Jiang wasn't afraid that she would take the money and run away. Jiang said he trusted her, adding that considering how much she would earn in the future, that amount was nothing. Then Xia stood up, saying she would accept the job. Jiang mentioned that since everything was settled, he would head back home as it was getting late. He asked her to send him her account number when she could, so he would transfer her July salary and continue paying her monthly. He also suggested she find a better place to live, as it wasn't safe for her to stay in that area alone. Jiang mentioned that he would be away for a few days and might not be able to contact her. Suddenly, she asked him to wait, telling him that he had been really kind earlier. Seeing this, Jiang felt awkward, wondering if she might actually like him. But he quickly brushed off the thought, assuming she was just thanking him for his help. Back in her home, Xia reflected on what she had said, feeling embarrassed about how she had spoken. A while later, Jiang was enjoying himself on a beach. Several beautiful women in bikinis were around him, and he felt happy to finally be at the beaches of Sanya. Life was short, and before you know it, another year begins. That's why it's important to travel and enjoy life while you're young. In a car, a driver asked where they were headed, and Jiang responded that they were going to the Sheraton Hotel. He thought about how much the trip had cost, but he knew the more he spent, the more he could return to the other world. He also mused that it would have been more fun if Jiao were with him. Soon after, the driver informed Jiang that they had arrived at their destination. Looking around, Jiang thought it was exactly what he expected from the most famous 5-star hotel in the world. Soon after, a young woman appeared, asking Jiang to follow her. She mentioned that if he needed anything, he could use the terminal to request whatever he desired. Entering his room, Jiang felt a wave of happiness. Jumping into the pool, he remarked that it was his first time doing something like this, and that it was incredible. Looking down, he noticed other girls having fun, and thought to himself that he had spent a few $100,000 in just 7 days, wondering how he should spend the rest. However, he soon forgot about it, thinking it was time to change. Lying on his bed, Jiang relaxed, saying that, as expected, the quality of this place was top-notch. In addition, there were many beautiful girls around, and the only thing that could top it off was his bottle of wine. But when he took a sip, he wasn't satisfied, complaining that it was too sour and unpleasant. He finally understood the rich people in movies. Soon after, the protagonist drifted off to sleep. Later, Jiang woke up feeling hungry and decided it was time to go hunt for some good food. As he got dressed and admired himself in the mirror, he was pleased with his appearance. At that moment, a machine notified him that he had received an invitation. Grabbing the paper, he wondered what it was, only to realize it was an invitation from the Prince of Saudi Arabia and his beloved princess for a birthday banquet. A little while later, Jiang was already at the banquet, analyzing the dishes in front of him. As he ate, the people around him looked at him with disdain. Finishing his meal, he commented that it was delicious and asked if there was more to eat. Glancing to the side, he noticed the people who had sent the invitation, talking excitedly in Arabic. Next to the prince was the princess. Noticing them, Jiang thought they were incredibly wealthy. However, he didn't care about them and continued to focus on his food. While the guests conversed with the prince, Jiang paid no attention, simply engrossed in his dishes. He thought to himself that these people were on another level, with rumors about celebrities constantly swirling around. Soon after, a man remarked that the steak Jiang was eating was of the highest quality. Jiang, in turn, agreed that it was quite good. The man mentioned that a single piece cost $300, and that watching Jiang eat, it made him uneasy. Shaking the protagonist's hand, the man introduced himself, saying that he had a keen eye for people. Looking at the man, Jiang thought that just by observing him, it was clear he smelled of trouble. The man told him not to be alarmed, he was just greeting a fellow professional. Realizing the man thought he was a security guard, Jiang asked if it was that obvious. The man then inquired if Jiang knew that all the security personnel had their eyes on him. Jiang asked why, as he was just a guy on vacation. The man explained that if he weren't in charge of the prince's security, he wouldn't have come to this event. But as soon as he walked into the room, the first thing that caught his eye was a potential problem. Jiang? He hoped Jiang was enjoying the food. Giving a signal to his companions, the man asked them to step back for now because he was keeping an eye on the target. Noticing that the man was still there, Jiang commented that he thought the man would have already gone to meet his mercenaries. The man replied that he had changed his mind, saying Jiang was good at conversation, and asked if he could say the word click in Mandarin. Jiang quickly realized the man was watching him closely, suspecting he would cause trouble. The man began telling a story about his life, but Jiang wasn't interested and continued eating. Meanwhile, the other guests around them began making toasts. At Jiang's table, the man continued talking despite the lack of attention, asking Jiang what he did for a living, as he didn't seem like someone who could afford to stay at a place like this. Jiang casually responded that he earned money to spend it. The man apologized, realizing Jiang didn't like discussing his business, but Jiang shrugged it off and mentioned that he dealt in gold. The man, thinking it must be in South Africa, commented that it sounded like a good opportunity. However, Jiang replied that he did his business in Asia. The man, surprised, noted that Asia wasn't typically known for that and asked how Jiang managed to close deals there. Jiang explained that it wasn't as the man thought. He simply conducted business in the region and was paid in gold. Hearing this, the man seemed skeptical, unsure whether to believe what Jiang had said. Changing the subject, the man once again asked Jiang to say the word click in Mandarin. After some time, Jiang had already eaten all the food, reflecting on the suspicious man who even gave him his card, wondering why he wanted to stay in touch. Meanwhile, a woman approached Jiang, asking if he was alone, as it had been a while since she had seen someone so handsome. Jiang confirmed he was alone and asked how he could help her. The woman then asked if he could accompany her to the beach. Jiang mentioned that it was a coincidence because he really needed some female company at his place. The girl then asked if she could go there, showing how big his property was. Introducing himself as Liu Yao to the green-haired girl, Jiang agreed, and soon after, they went to have some fun at his house. Sometime later, the girl was sleeping in his room. Meanwhile, Jiang was looking at the beach view, commenting that 3 of his physical attributes had increased by 2 points. He thought the effect of the genetic medication had completely worn off. If he wanted to further improve his physical abilities, he would have to either train or take something even stronger. Jiang wondered how Jiao and the other girl were doing, but he decided to forget about it for now and enjoy himself, questioning if there was anything else he wanted to do. Soon after, the girl appeared again, saying that drinking wine so early wasn't good for his stomach. Jiang pulled the woman onto his lap, telling her to enjoy a little with him. However, he said there was something he still didn't understand, mentioning that she was beautiful and smart and asking how she hadn't landed a prominent role yet. Yao responded that being beautiful was sometimes considered a crime. Sometime later, Jiang was back in his room with the girl, who was posting some photos online, commenting on how luxurious the house was and that she was posting them to make her friends jealous. Jiang remarked that if anyone found out she had a man with her, she might get caught up in a scandal. But the girl said she had always thought it would be exciting to get involved in something like that, as such a rumor would make her more popular. Putting that aside, she mentioned she wanted to enjoy herself a little more. Observing the situation, Jiang wondered why he felt like he was being used. The girl, on the other hand, said she wanted to sunbathe and asked Jiang to put sunscreen on her. Irritated, Jiang commented that she had waited until he put on his new clothes to ask for that. While they were enjoying the sun, someone called John. It was the man from earlier, asking if Jiang remembered him. Yo asked if that man was a friend of Jiang's. He replied that he was just a colleague. Yo asked if he wanted her to leave, but Jiang said it wasn't necessary, mentioning that he just needed to go to his room and grab his bags because he wouldn't have time to do it later. A while later, Jiang and the man were chatting. Jiang asked if he wasn't the head of security for the Saudi prince and how he managed to find time to chat. The man explained that his ex-boss had overheard their conversation the night before and had become very interested, showing great curiosity about the protagonist and wanting to meet him. Thinking the man wanted to hire him, Jiang said he didn't want to waste his vacation. However, the man clarified that Jiang had misunderstood, mentioning that Mr. Robert was well known for having lots of oil and gold. Hearing this, Jiang became interested and said he would meet this friend. 10 minutes later, Jiang was making his way to the location, and a bodyguard mentioned that the protagonist was arriving. Soon after, the man welcomed Jiang. Jiang said it was a pleasure to meet him, mentioning that he must be Robert, as the other man had spoken highly of him. Sitting down, he commented that Robert was quite impressive. Robert said it was only natural, as they had always maintained good relations with the countries of the East and there were many business opportunities there. He introduced his bodyguard, mentioning that the man from before was a good person, but sometimes got too close to the FBI, so he preferred working with a different partner. Jiang asked if Robert's work was that dangerous, as he had heard from Blues that Robert was well known, and asked if he dealt with oil and gold. The man responded that in addition to those things, sometimes he had to help his clients choose weapons and other materials of that sort. After all, once you get involved in these things, it's hard to avoid being marked by certain people. But his country had strict arms regulations, so it was practically a vacation paradise. It was a pity that the fun wouldn't last long. For instance, soon he would embark for a village in southern Africa. Jiang asked if the man had time to continue the conversation, but the man reassured him not to worry, mentioning that he was very interested in the protagonist's business and asking if there was anything he could help with. He emphasized that Jiang shouldn't misunderstand his intentions. He just happened to overhear the conversation with the other man the previous day. He had always been interested in doing business in East Asia, but all the merchants of that type were still emerging. Jiang, in turn, asked the man for some examples of what he meant, and the man asked if Jiang's transactions were in gold. However, as far as he knew, Jiang's country had very strict laws and large gold transactions could attract the government's attention. Jiang remarked that the man seemed to know his country very well and asked if it wasn't a problem to sell gold in America. The man responded that it was an issue there, but they could discuss the laws and legalities with a specialized team that handled these small problems. To illustrate his point, he gave an example. If a Saudi supply company received oil from there, the transaction would be illegal in Iran. But if they circled their supply posts in Saudi Arabia, a shipment would eventually be converted into something legally sold on the global market. Observing the situation, Jiang seemed to believe the man as a possible partnership was forming. The man reassured Jiang not to worry, as he was always honest in his dealings and could handle whatever amount Jiang wanted, as long as the gold passed through one of his mining programs in South Africa. He assured Jiang that he wouldn't have to worry about any details. He would only need to sell the gold, and the man would take only 9% commission from the total. However, Jiang didn't like the sound of that. The man thought that 9% was a bit high, but such an enterprise was risky, and to raise enough capital for someone buying gold, he needed a higher value. However, the man quickly reconsidered, thinking he needed to lower that rate. Just as he was about to offer a lower percentage, Jiang quickly accepted the proposal, saying he could guarantee the gold was pure 24 carats. However, Jiang made it clear that the transportation would be the man's responsibility, as he would only bring it into the country, and the payment would be made in dollars locally. Once the gold left his hands, Jiang said he wouldn't be responsible for anything further. Even with all these conditions, the man simply agreed, sealing the deal. He handed Jiang a card, saying that once he secured the shipment, all Jiang had to do was contact him. He also suggested opening a Swiss account to make things easier. Taking the card, Jiang hoped everything would work out. The man asked how much gold Jiang planned to dispose of, as he needed to prepare enough capital. Jiang told him not to rush things and said he would contact him by mid-July. As for the quantity, Jiang mentioned it would be several tons. The man was completely shocked by what he heard. With a 9% commission, if it were 3 tons, he would earn $10 million in commissions, money that could keep him awake at night. This was an opportunity to become extremely wealthy. The man asked the bodyguard what he thought of his Asian friend and if he was trustworthy. The bodyguard replied that he couldn't say for sure, but he could affirm that the protagonist was very dangerous. Performing various maneuvers, the man asked if the protagonist knew Kung Fu. The bodyguard said that Jiang might be a businessman, but he estimated that he wasn't weak. His instincts told him Jiang wasn't a threat with firearms. However, in hand-to-hand combat, the odds would be 50-50. Afterward, the man suggested that since they were in the east, they should stop by Egypt. Outside, Jiang was walking, feeling pleased with how things had turned out. He thought he had found a bed of flowers to rest in and could finally move the large quantity of gold, as he had been increasingly worried about it. His original plan was to divide the gold and sell it in various stores, even though it was a slow and risky method. This auction was the safest he had. Each shipment would contain 1 billion in gold, so he would have to move it after each sale, and now he no longer needed to hold back. because if his foreign friend could really handle everything, the legalization process would be fine. He wondered how difficult it would be to carry gold, as just a little would take up 5 cubic meters. Meanwhile, that girl from before was looking out at the beach, asking why Jang took so long since she was starving. Quickly, Jang suggested they go eat. Inside the restaurant, the girl noticed some penguins and remarked how cute they were. Jang responded that he had heard the place was quite beautiful at night. Noticing the young man's expression, the woman mentioned that he seemed very happy that day. Jang replied that he had made a good deal earlier. This left the girl surprised, as she thought it was because of her, but the protagonist asked if she could guess the value of the deal. She responded, thinking maybe it was $1 million, but lamented that even with such a good deal, she wouldn't get anything from it. Jang replied that was just a part of it and he wasn't even sure, but the amount he could earn was likely around $1 billion. This left the woman completely shocked by what she heard, telling Jang that he had real potential. However, the young man remarked that she had already checked out his potential the night before. And so 5 very exciting days passed for the protagonist in every sense. On a plane, a girl served him coffee. Jang thought to himself that the vacation had been amazing. However, it was a shame that he didn't know if he would ever see that girl again in the future. Sometime later, Jang was talking with that girl from before, mentioning that he knew the man was away, but he hadn't even been able to answer his calls. Our guy asked her not to get so upset, as he'd take her next time to see the amazing view from that place. Xia replied that the boss needed to show up from time to time, and that afternoon he'd go with her to the factory and the 6th trading house since the paperwork was organized and everything was on track. Seeing her effort, Jang thanked her for all the hard work. He told her that they'd definitely go that afternoon, but putting work aside for a moment, he asked what she wanted, as she could ask for anything. Looking at the menu, the girl seemed overwhelmed by the many options. Jang told her to relax, assuring her he'd pay for whatever she wanted, asking if she had been eating well over the past few days. Soon after, the waitress arrived to take their orders. Noticing the woman's expression, the protagonist asked if something was bothering her. Shazai replied that the company's situation looked different. Jang asked if people didn't say that every company had unlimited potential in the beginning, to which the girl responded that this only applied to companies with competent cores. She asked if he really knew what advanced technology they would commercialize and whether he remembered advanced algorithms. Jang asked who would remember that kind of thing after graduation, saying he couldn't use that as an example. Still, he assured her that there was no need to worry about innovation, as to start, the company would develop games and then enter the mobile phone market. Interrupting, the woman asked if they would be mobile online games or just PC games, because given the current market, starting with mobile games would be better. As for the mobile phone market, it was a good idea, but they needed to keep their feet on the ground. Only then would the company grow even more. Jang replied that they should take one step at a time, but to move forward, he would have to focus a bit on manager Xia, as she would earn 10% of everything. Kanzia asked when she had ever earned those 10%, and Jang replied that he had just given them to her. He then mentioned that the food had arrived, so they should eat. Xia was surprised, as things hadn't even happened yet, and still the protagonist was already dividing the money. However, the young man didn't seem to care much about that and was simply enjoying his meal. Later, that business meeting had ended, and the young man was lying on his bed. He thought that Xia had a lot of energy, wondering how she managed to keep going back and forth between the factory and the trade sector like that. Moreover, things were progressing quite well. Grabbing his phone, he realized that he needed to prepare to return to that other world. He started ordering several things to bring with him, saying he needed to focus on the essentials. He mentioned that it had been a long time since he returned, and he needed to see how things were going there. Meanwhile, in the post-apocalyptic world, a spaceship seemed to be flying, and the man said that Team 1 had reached the target's location. Activating the life detection device, the system began scanning the entire area. The man mentioned that the target had been spotted. Another individual confirmed that the life signatures matched and they were in the building. He ordered Team 1 to attack. However, the blue-haired man requested that they hold off. He questioned what was inside that building and ordered to be taken to the top. Announcing that the Black Rider group was directly above the target, they acknowledged that they were unsure of the situation and requested maximum artillery support. Inside a command tower, someone confirmed the orders and began preparing for the strike. Another individual reported that the impact would occur in 60 seconds, requesting they increase altitude. A massive ballistic device was being prepared, and within seconds, it launched. A countdown began. The man thought that the ability to instantly destroy an entire building was quite a destructive force. He announced that the kill was confirmed, but immediately after, something caught his attention. In a flash, one of their ships was destroyed. Inside the command tower, the man requested status confirmation from everyone. The pilot reported that they were crashing and urgently needed reinforcements. The pilot of the ship mentioned they had been hit by an electromagnetic pulse, rendering their controls useless. In a moment of adrenaline, the blue-haired man ordered everyone to jump. As the ship began to explode, he and his companions jumped out, activating jetpacks attached to their backs, urging everyone to focus on their mission. One of the soldiers informed the captain that the electromagnetic pulse had come from that thing, and they had hit a jackpot. The crystal readings were at 90,141. The The captain acknowledged this and said they would figure out how to harvest them once everyone was together. One of the subordinates questioned why they had been assigned to this mission, stating that the larger the crystal count, the more dangerous the organism. The man smiled, explaining that when these monsters reach a certain level of mutation, they cease to pose a significant threat. That's why organisms with crystal readings above 90,000 are considered harmless. The radiation continuously causes cellular expansion while consuming energy. So while the swelling makes them stronger, it also weakens them. Suddenly, one of the soldiers noted that something was wrong. A mutant of that extreme level should have attracted scavengers, but there wasn't even a single mutant rat around. Then the mutant began aiming upwards. The captain immediately ordered them to open fire, as it was starting a self-destruct sequence. If it finished charging, they would all die. However, the creature exploded and everyone was vaporized. A woman informed the captain that the entire team had gone offline, and the energy readings from the crystal indicated that the target had split, with the system now detecting 12 different forms. The man ordered the entire team to prepare for deployment. Meanwhile, Jiang Chen remarked that the place hadn't changed at all. It was still the same chaotic mess. As he began to grow accustomed to the air of that world, he realized that he truly couldn't teleport living things. Arriving at the base, he questioned whether it was the same place he had visited a month ago. Opening the gate, Sun Jiao greeted him with a hug, and Jiang Chen admitted he had missed her. She proudly said she would show him her masterpiece, explaining that she had replaced all the sculptures and fountains with fortifications. She had also built a watchtower surrounded by barbed wire. Jiang Chen questioned if they could still call it a mansion since she had turned it into a fortress. Sun Jiao explained that the place had been practically unprotected, so she had reinforced it. Jiang suggested she could have left it as it was, but Sun Jiao replied that this was their home. They couldn't continue pretending no one lived there since a survivor might start investigating. The protagonist acknowledged she had done a good job. Then he asked where Yo was, and Sun Jiao mentioned she was locked in her room, working on some upgrades. Entering Yo's room, Jiang found everything in disarray. He sat down to take a look at what Yo had been working on. Despite his level 2 in computing, he couldn't make sense of anything. He approached her bed and tried to grab a book lying on top of her, but Yao suddenly sat up, mumbling in her sleep, then laid back down again. Jiang Chen thinks that girl needed to sleep a little as she deserved it, and that she and Sun Jiao must have caused chaos around those parts. Wondering if they had gone out to look for books in that zombie-infested area and if he should explain the situation to them soon. Then he encounters Sun Jiao wearing a sexy outfit and asks the protagonist to come down there. Jiang Chen, in turn, comments that those black stockings didn't suit her. Sun Jiao asks if he had anything else to say. The boy, in turn, says to wait for Yo to wake up so they could have a family meeting. However, the girl then ties up the protagonist and removes his shirt, while saying she had learned that from the pre-war libraries. Jiang Chen says she hadn't smelled him when she entered, so he thought she didn't know. The girl asks if he had committed treason. While nodding, the protagonist says he promised to do anything to make up for it. Sun Jiao smiles and says he would have to see again how incredible she was, beginning to run her hands over the protagonist. However, both remember they now had a child at home, so the girl takes a deep breath and says that the intruder had been contained and that Yao should watch him. As the woman runs off, the young man asks to be released. Then Yo appears and questions how that knot in the rope had been made. Right after, Jiang Chen sits on the couch and says he had something important to tell and that they should get straight to the point. Then he admits that he came from another world. Sun Jiao smiles and says she already knew. The protagonist then demonstrates his powers, and Yao asks if he was some kind of god. Jiang Chen says he didn't pull those items out of thin air, explaining that he had a temporal warehouse, but only he could see and use it, and that he stored things from the other world in this warehouse to transport them. However, he says he had already tried to transport something alive besides himself. Yo says that wouldn't be good, as it could bring mutant bacteria to the boy's world. Jiang Chen is surprised, as he had never thought of that, and concludes that the bracelet probably kills all external life during the trip, otherwise his world would already be infected. He then says he had brought supplies to exchange for crystals and also things to improve their village. Sun Jiao says the survivor camps would pay, but the young man says he doesn't trust those camps, so he would go to 6th Street. The girl in turn says that Huivyu's mercenaries would be waiting for them. The boy tells her to relax, as he wouldn't risk himself even for 2 minutes. Immediately after, he uses his teleportation. Upon returning, he says making so many trips was tedious, but this way he would be able to go alone to 6th Street and use the dimensional warehouse to bring the goods. Then he says that Sun Jiao needed to stay to protect the house because there was no one else capable of doing so, and that she could hire some people there. Since that area was very large, they wouldn't be able to defend it alone. Yao remains silent and asks the boy if he didn't meet her anymore. But the young man replies that he just didn't want her to get tired. Sun Jiao says there was something dangerous he needed to be careful about, that it was not to remove the electronic collars from the slaves. Jiang Chen says he already knew about that and that he used to have a peaceful way of thinking to deal with the problems of that world. But now, he wasn't going to do that anymore. Then the girl asks if the family meeting had ended. But the young man says there was still one more issue to discuss, and it was about the girl asking if she could tell. The girl is surprised because he still remembered. She was happy with the life she was living, and that this was, in fact, her home. A man says they managed to collect some worthless things. While pulling Sunjo's hair, he says that her family wasn't there anymore, and he tells his boss that even if they sold them, they wouldn't even make enough money for gas. The leader, in turn, says that if they were that useless, they should throw them to the zombies, and that they should do it quickly because they had problems on the way. The girl thinks she was going to die right there. However, a sniper appears and shoots one of the soldiers. While they search for a place to take cover, another man is hit. The leader orders them to open fire to the southwest. However, the woman advances and slashes the soldiers' throats. One of the men tries to shoot her. However, the girl dodges and kills him. While hiding, Sunjo thinks about how she doesn't want to die. Then the woman says everything was fine now and asks if the girl wants to go with her. Sunjiao realizes that all the men have been killed. The girl takes off her helmet and says they were just a group of slave traders, and that Shelter 71 was just a refugee shelter. So the world outside is very different from the shelter. Right after, she gives a piece of bread to the girl. While walking together, the girl explains that her job was to clear the wasteland and that to survive, she had to kill people. Then she asks what the girl plans to do. However, Sunjiao remains silent. The woman says there was a new survivor camp nearby and that she could take her there. But the girl replies no. The girl says she thought the age of genetic deficiencies had passed, so the girl couldn't be changed. Then she asks the girl to say where she wants to go, because without a goal, she wouldn't last long in that hell. Sunjiao in turn replies that she wants to find her family. The girl says then she better hurry because the girl still had a lot to learn. Returning to the present, Jiang asks what happened after that. After that, she slowly discovered that her mentor was lying and that there were no more families in the wasteland. And it would be strange if there were, because families are easy targets. Gradually, she understood that even if she found them, her family wouldn't be able to return to the life they had before. Thus, her mentor taught her how to survive in the wasteland while turning her into a soldier. But her mentor was quite strange because she was in charge of killing people but always wasted her time doing unnecessary things. And she was so mysterious until the day she disappeared out of nowhere. Afterward, she tried to find her, but everyone said she had died in a battle. After that, Jo began to wander around alone. Thus, passing through many places, in the end she finally managed to confirm something, that her parents were simply no longer alive. However, her little sister was still alive, and no one could say whether she was dead. So she continued to search for the girl, looking for the place where her father used to live before in the shelter, and that was where this house was. The protagonist already knew this because after searching all over for food, she ended up exhausted and malnourished. Searching the entire house for food, but all she found was a change of clothes, which she changed into, waiting for death. However, when she was about to faint, a shadow entered her house. It was simply the protagonist coming in to help her. Jiang, in turn, questions who was calling him a shadow, as he had knocked several times before entering her house. Jiao says that in the end he took everything and had entered without her permission. The protagonist thinks he now understood, and from now on, he would keep an eye out to get information about her little sister. Meanwhile, Yahello asks if she could do something for the little girl. However, she was already very happy, as she already had a family right there in that place. This made the protagonist happy, seeing that it was enough for her. At that moment, he remembers that he needed the little girl's help for something, showing a cell phone to the girl, asking if that was an electronic device, and her tools were beyond that place. Jiao, in turn, asked them to go take care of it, as it would involve all the supplies. Entering the little girl's room, the girl asked them to be careful with the wires. Looking around, Jiang is surprised because that house didn't seem like Jiao's. Although now it looked like a mad scientist's lab. Sitting in her chair, the girl asked the protagonist to show the technology from his world. The boy says it wasn't something that incredible, as it was just a regular cell phone. And the girl, not knowing what that was, asks what it could be. Jiang, surprised, asks if Yahello hadn't lived during the pre-war period, as they didn't know what video games were back then. Shortly after, the girl says she seemed to understand what the boy was trying to say, because in the pre-war era there were a lot of shooting games, but they were all played in gaming capsules. Conventional games were all projected on a virtual reality engine, and playing while lying down alleviated fatigue and allowed continued playing for a long time. Jiang thinks that it's not that they didn't have mobile games, but that they were already more obsolete than before, wondering if they should give up on mobile games or port them to a VR system. However, that probably wouldn't be possible, saying that he could research as much as he wanted, but the technology was his. Starting to fiddle with the cell phone, the girl asks what kind of old processor it was, as it used touch on the keyboard, asking if it still had an internal HD and if it was still in gigabytes. A while later, the girl seems to have finished her work, saying that it didn't seem too difficult because if she used too much language she could get anything on it, but the space was too small. Programming games was one thing, but art, music, and gameplay were areas in which she had no experience. The boy thinks his expectations were too high, but not every programmer is a game designer. Even reducing the hardware requirements, the gameplay would still make a difference. However, soon after, the girl seems to remember something, asking the boy to leave it to her, as she promised she would be able to produce it in less than 5 days, leaving the boy surprised at what he had heard, as he thought it would take at least a few months. Yahello says that starting everything from scratch is going to be a little problematic, but she remembered there was a public library nearby. And that's where Joe got reference books, because the library's database has a lot of historical code sources, so mobile games could be found there. Picking the girl up, the protagonist is happy, saying that she was the cutest thing in that world, leaving the girl flustered by what she had heard. As they start to leave the room, the protagonist wishes her good work. Meanwhile, Joe seems to be organizing those supplies, stating that she had finally finished her work. At that moment, the protagonist grabs her from behind, saying that she had done a good job. The girl, in turn, asks why he hadn't come to help, and Jang responds that he didn't know she would move everything so quickly to the basement. Then Joe says that it was food, so she needed to store it as quickly as possible. However, Jang asks her not to worry about that, as they wouldn't die of hunger. Embarrassed, Joe says she had brought a little more gold for him, and it was all outside, so he should go take a look. Our boy says that a lot had happened that day, but it seems someone had forgotten what she had done that morning. Then several unexpected things begin to happen, and the protagonist says she could scream until she lost her voice, as no one would come to save her. A while later, the protagonist is with his sniper, aiming at a zombie. Pulling the trigger, he seems to miss his target, feeling frustrated with what had happened, thinking that he aimed for the head, but only managed to hit the chest. So he should try again and aim a little higher. Thus, he successfully lands a headshot, leaving Zhao surprised by what the protagonist had done. She tells him to keep it up, as he needed to adjust the angle according to the distance, asking him to have some common sense, as at that moment he was using active targets for practice, but if he ever came face to face with a horde of zombies, any mistake could cost him his life. Zhao, while aiming with her sniper, thinks she had assumed that when his body improved, this wouldn't be a problem anymore. Meanwhile, the sun was setting, and Zhao says to stop when night falls, as zombies tend to get more dangerous, and for that reason, they shouldn't provoke them. Analyzing the statistics, she says that out of 120 bullets, there were 60 hits and 29 kills, which was acceptable, saying that the protagonist had passed the test. Therefore, she could already send him to 6th Street, and with that, he would be able to avoid them a bit more, asking the boy to go inside as it was time for dinner. Concerned about it, our boy questions whether he would really be able to do it. Thus, the day passes and we are in another moment. Jang says he had several things to trade and that what he needed quick access to, he would put in his backpack. The protagonist, in turn, asks him to be quick and careful with it. Zhao, still sleepy from just waking up, asks if the boy was already leaving again, asking him to wait a little, as she would be right back. However, Jiang says he was just going quickly to 6th Street and would be back before she even missed him. Even so, Zhao asks him to wait a little, as the girl had been preparing something for a while. Coming down the stairs, the girl seems to have a backpack in hand, mentioning that it was something she had made for the protagonist. A mini-drone that could be connected to his EP is scanned kilometers of distance. Because of that, it could be a big help for the protagonist, mentioning that she was very sleepy and should go back to sleep. Jiang, watching the little girl lying on the couch, asks if she wasn't afraid of catching a cold. Right after, he covers the girl with a blanket. Then his girlfriend says he should go quickly. A while later, the protagonist seems to have reached his destination. Surprised, as he didn't expect it to be so far, since it had taken him 5 hours to get there. Sometime later, our boy seems to be analyzing everything around a building, saying that it seemed clean around. Meanwhile, several people were lined up heading somewhere, and a blonde-haired man was telling them to stay in line as they were going to have all their EPs ready. Meanwhile, Jiang seems to be analyzing something on his smartphone, thinking that he had managed to get in quickly, and now had to do what he was planning. Approaching a man, he says he wanted a spot in that container, and the man asked him to fill out a form with the container size and have his EP ready, and as soon as he was done, he would bring it to him. After all the bureaucratic process, the man asked the protagonist to follow him, saying that it was a regular cargo and a key with a deposit of 3 crystals. Mentioning that the deposit had been received, he says he had nothing else to do with the protagonist. The boy, in turn, is pleased, thinking that he hadn't drawn anyone's attention, and first, he would store the canned meat and the biscuits along with the other things. Leaving the place, he thinks that now he was in the inner circle, but first he needed to sell what he had in hand to get more people. And Jay had warned not to take people without value to helps, so he would need to go to the inner circle and find people with no criminal records and useful skills. Meanwhile, the protagonist seems to be analyzing something, wondering if that was some kind of weapon in the inner city. Shortly after, a man appears, asking if he was trying to enter that place, mentioning that he would need his EP and a crystal to erase the entry, and for that reason, he couldn't carry weapons. Seeming to make some sort of deal with the man, the boy thanks him for his contribution. Entering that place, the protagonist thinks it was really different, but first he needed to find a good hotel to stay in. Observing what was in front of him, he thinks that one might be good. Inside the place, a man asks what he can do to help the protagonist, who responds by asking for their best room and that he would pay for a week, leaving the man completely surprised by what he had heard, asking if he was sure about it, as he wanted a premium suite for 7 days and was going to pay 70 crystals up front. However, the young man says that's exactly what he wanted. Meanwhile, an older man seems to be analyzing the protagonist's photo, asking if he was a food producer, which was very interesting. Then a woman asks if he would like her to make a visit to him, However, the man says it wasn't necessary, as they would just observe for a bit. Shortly after, that young man seems to be eating something, thinking it was delicious, though it was already the last one. As he begins eating, the man marvels at it, and his assistant, watching him eat, thinks she wanted to try some as well. A while later, the man had already finished his meal, saying that purchasing in the inner circle in the past few days had been difficult. Even though it cost 60 crystals each, everyone fought hard for it. Even so, it was a shame because even dividing it into 3 meals, it was gone in just one day. Afterward, he looks again at the spreadsheet with the protagonist's name, mentioning that the man seemed familiar for some reason and that he had seen him somewhere before. Meanwhile, Jiang was inside a technological device. As he gets out, he thinks it was amazing, as that nutrient capsule even had a massage function. And that goo was really incredible, as the technology never ceased to amaze him. Now he should see what else was there to play with around the place. Nearby, he notices a ping-pong table with a robot controlling the paddle. Accepting the challenge, he says he would have to teach that robot a lesson with his national championship-level skills from China. However, the young man ends up getting a huge beating, as he lost 11-0, wondering if that was the Stereo 7 HD simulation system, and if it wouldn't be like the pen that Scammer had handed him, as it resembled the black and white TV remote when it was broken. Within seconds, it seems he has been transported to a bustling city, wondering what kind of madness was happening in front of him. Observing the simulated people around, he thinks that device was really incredible, because everything around him seems so real. Changing eras, he realizes it even included the Industrial Revolution, and beyond that, World War II. Thinking he liked that 7D projector of a life capsule, so he would consider finding a way to bring one home. Additionally, that place even had made robots. Imagining the possibility of the otaku public buying that model, as it would be unfair not to have one. But something didn't feel right about that place, as he made sure to pick the most expensive hotel yesterday to catch some big fish. However, the day was almost over already, wondering why nothing had happened yet and if they had forgotten about his last sale of cans. Or perhaps it was the possibility of making first contact. Shortly after, someone knocks on his door and the protagonist quickly says he's on his way. And then it is revealed that it was the man from before, the one who had been looking at the protagonist's spreadsheet. The boy, now dressed, asks who the young man could be. He responds that his name is Zhao Chen, and that was his secretary named Su. Inside his quarters, the protagonist asks them to take a seat. Sitting down in his chair, the man apologizes for disturbing him. And at the same moment, he seems surprised by what he saw in front of him, because the protagonist was eating several oranges from a jar, wondering how long it had been since he had seen a real fruit. The other girl once again thinks she wanted to taste it, even if it was just one. Jiang, in turn, asks if they hadn't noticed or if they were pretending. Jiang mentions that it seemed Zhao had already done some research on him, and the man says that with the detailed registration Jiang had made, it was almost impossible not to look him up. However, our boy asks to leave that aside, as they should eat some fruit first. Those were canned fruits, a specialty of his company, and he confessed that he had a weakness for oranges, so he decided to bring some and hope they would like them, leaving the man completely surprised that he had brought all that to serve them. In disbelief, the secretary asks if they could really eat that, and the protagonist replies that they had just been opened and were specially prepared for them. Realizing the situation, the man thinks that his hand wouldn't stop trembling. As he begins to eat, he thinks it tasted very good, and the juice was spraying through his mouth as if his body were melting. However, at the same moment, he quickly regains his composure. Jiang, noticing how much they enjoyed the food, thinks that he can now relax a little more. He asks what they thought of the fruit. The man responds that they were very tasty. Although 6th Street is capable of producing some fruits, the quantity is extremely low. It is difficult to cultivate fruits, not only because of the radiation but also due to their particularities. Only a few can be consumed, while the rest would lose their nutrients. Jiang then says that's exactly why he's there. And the man assumes that the canned goods that appeared at the exchange house were likely the protagonist's doing, so he should inform him that he was also somewhat close to being a trader from 6th Street. Our boy mentions that those canned goods were sold at the exchange house for 50 crystals each, but he heard they sold them for 60. Summarizing all of this, Jiang was hoping to make some kind of deal with that organization. However, Jiang says he was also thinking about the possibility of negotiating with them numerous times. Then the young man says he would reintroduce himself, stating his name was Zhao Chen, from the 10th seat of the committee and president of a group called Zhao. And on behalf of his group, he would like to invite Jiang's company to 6th Street to discuss a potential partnership. Jiang, introducing himself, says he was right when they said he would find his trade partner by going to that place. The man, surprised, asks if the boy had a stable source of resources. However, the young man asks him to calm down, requesting they sit down to discuss the details. Sometime later, our protagonist seems to be shooting at targets with a rifle, putting into practice what Joe had taught him. Zhao asks what he thought of the rifles as they were produced there on 6th Street. Jiang mentions that they were already more stable than his own weapons, asking for 40 similar ones and several types of grenades to be added. Shortly after, the secretary hands over the trade specifications, asking Jiang to take a look. While he reviews the agreement, Zhao mentions that the protagonist had seen how good their weapons were. The secretary says she would like to check his registration data to ensure there were no issues, and her president would inform him about potential population problems along with the weapons deal. Then Zhao invites the boy to visit his weapons factory. Inside, Jiang thinks that being a council member wasn't a small deal, as not just anyone could own a factory of that size. The secretary explains that it was their main production line responsible for manufacturing weapons and ammunition. Looking up, Jiang asks what that was. The director responds that they were drones capable of carrying up to 50 kilograms, equipped with a self-destruct function. He asks the boy to take a look at them. Surprised, Jiang thinks he should put on his sunglasses. Then Zhao says that was their weapons testing field. At that moment, the device is activated. However, the man in the area didn't suffer a scratch. Jiang, impressed, asks if the man would give him some of those. Zhao mentions that they had produced only a few and 6th Street was updating its weapons to the point of revising them again. He suggests they continue, mentioning that this was the assembly and verification workshop for the robots. Jiang thinks it was the first time he got a good look at futuristic weapons. He wonders how strong the monsters in that world were. Then the director calls the protagonist, saying he knew that Jiang worked in the field and therefore often faced many dangers. He offers him a nitrogen armor as a gift. The nitrogen would be pushed into its atomic vortex, causing an explosion of high-pressure circulation. Meanwhile, in that room, a man seems to use a barrier. Successfully, he manages to block the shot. Zhao says that with that energy and protection, he could withstand up to 4 weapons from their simulation. Jiang, surprised, thinks that was practically an energy shield. The man then asks if the boy was satisfied with what he saw. He responds that he was, but asks if that device had any limitations. The man responds that it had very few, as it only consumed a lot of energy and had overheating issues. Surprised, the protagonist says he didn't know Zhao was an expert in weapons, but the man says they should get to the most important point. One day in the post-war period, Zhao, along with his wife, had woken up. He had been the chief engineer before the war, so he had the opportunity to enjoy the hibernation chamber with his family. But it was unfortunate that the post-war world turned out to be the opposite of what they had imagined. Thus, the bandits took everything they had, and the refugees ended up becoming commodities to be exploited. There were those who became partners of the oppressors, as well as those who sacrificed themselves so that others could live, and the rest were sold. One of the slaves mentioned that they saw value in his labor, and so they gave him something to do. The man thinks the funniest thing was that being a chief engineer didn't help at all, and he was only chosen because he was fit for manual labor. That slave became an assembler on a production line. But amid all the misery, he had a small moment of happiness as a few weeks later, his wife was sold to the same block as him. The man thinks they were lucky to find each other again. However, one day about 40 people were called in for a routine quarantine. This so-called quarantine happened when they marked people with infection X1, a procedure used to get rid of the infected. The slave wonders why he didn't resist, because from the moment they entered Block 6, their lives no longer belonged to them. He then sees his wife and some other women, and he thinks they were in the group to be sold as battle forces, so he didn't understand why the women were there too. Then he and his wife find themselves in a truck. Apparently there are other families besides them in the vehicle. The slave thinks that all the people there had good technological knowledge. In other words, they were useless. Then the truck stops. As Jem puts food on the plates, he says those people must be tired and asks them to get down to eat. The man thinks he never imagined he would smell rice again. The slaves get off the truck, wondering if this was really happening, questioning whether this was just a fake experiment. However, they were so hungry that they couldn't resist the smell. Then they eat the food, satisfied, and thank Jiang for the meal. Jiang Chen says they don't need to thank him and that there was enough for everyone. But if he saw anyone wasting food, he would make them eat it all until they vomited. Sun Jiao says they used 1 kilogram of rice with 2 pieces of dried meat and 3 cabbages for that meal. However, the protagonist says those things were nothing, and now that they had finished eating, they should get to business. Sun Jiao gets irritated by the boy's nonchalance. Then Jiang Chen walks over to the slaves and asks if everyone had eaten. The people in turn remain silent. The boy says that if they want to eat the next day, they need to answer him. The man responds that everyone was satisfied. Jiang Chen then says he figured everyone was wondering what their situation was. And to summarize, he had fed them and would guarantee them unimaginable fortune. So all he expected from them was not to be useless and to prove they were worthy of 3 meals a day. He then returns to his world, thinking about how tiring it was. It had been meeting after meeting and hiring after hiring. But now everything was fine because at least the game development base was set up, and they even got some cooks. And it seemed like he hit the jackpot by choosing to buy those slaves from Zhao. Immediately after, he pulls out all the gold he had gotten from his warehouse, and his neighbors get annoyed because it made so much noise. Jiang Chen, in turn, apologizes for the disturbance. Then his phone starts ringing. The boy thinks it's probably a bunch of messages from Xia and decides to answer the call. However, the person on the other end is upset because he hadn't paid rent in 6 months. The young man thinks he doesn't have the energy to argue and that it's probably time to say goodbye to that place. Unbothered, the protagonist tells the landlord to rent the apartment to someone else. and then he hangs up. Afterward, he decides to call Xia. When she answers, the woman asks if the president had really returned. Jiang Chen says he's been busy with business. The girl, in turn, asks if he knows that the company is still in its early stages. The protagonist thinks she's still tough, and then asks if she could go with him to see a house, and she hangs up the call. However, he calls again. Xia gets irritated but thinks she should stay calm and take a deep breath. When she answers the call, she asks why he needed her to buy a house. Jiang Chen says that he had almost resolved the issue of mobile game development, and that they could now consider the development phase complete. They just needed to hire a few specialists to review the projects. Xia says that to prevent her boss from getting out of line, she feels obligated to handle the mundane tasks of the job and will research properties with good prices. After hanging up, the boy thinks that there was no one more suited to handle that than his formidable ex-boss. He then decides to deal with the gold issue, thinking it was time to bother his foreign friend. However, the man takes a while to answer, leaving the boy confused because it should be gay time there. But shortly after, someone answers asking who it was. The protagonist introduces himself and asks who he was speaking to. The man says he is Nick Kaczynski and that his boss was in trouble, asking if he could count on the boy for something. Jiang Chen says yes, as he was a close friend of Robert's, and they still had business to finish. He then puts away his phone, thinking that if the gold sat idle, business opportunities would pass by, and that converting that gold into cash would be a lot of work. He then thinks that he doesn't want to become a target for some secret agency because if they discover anything, he would be in big trouble, so he decides to travel. After all, he had gotten his passport back in college, and considering his current body, he would be unbeatable. He then pulls up Liu and Shan's number and thinks he first needs to set aside some money. When he calls the man, he says he has some business to take care of with him tomorrow. By the next morning, everything had already been credited to his account. Liu and Shan tells the protagonist to be careful on the road. After the boy leaves, the man thinks that there was really something big behind him, and then he decides to call his brother, saying that he had checked everything about the young man and that he had no presence or background. And just now, he had gained an additional 7 kilos. Liu and Shan mentions that the boy could be a tomb raider or might have discovered a mine. The man then says that once the job was done, the Hongyi gang wouldn't bother him anymore. The call ends, and Liu and Shan says that now the boy is in his hands. A man throws bread to a young man, saying that if he doesn't eat, he'll die. That prisoner was Robert, a businessman whose ventures spanned various international industries, but 3 days ago, one of his informants betrayed him. Now he finds himself in a terrorist fortress, watching as a poor soul is dragged off for execution, because once they lost their usefulness, they were killed. Robert is not scared. This isn't the first time something like this has happened to him. Last time, he almost had his throat cut, but the mercenaries accepted his bribe. However, he thinks this time the situation is more serious, even though he's a valuable citizen to a nation. And if he hadn't been captured, Nick wouldn't be in such a difficult position. No matter how incredible Nick is, he's still just one man, and handling an entire group of terrorists was a bit complicated for him. But Robert still believes there's a chance and intends to resist as long as possible. As he eats the bread, Robert thinks about how tough it is to chew. Upon exiting the airport, Jiang Chen thinks it seems more peaceful than he imagined. He then shows a map to a taxi driver and asks him to take him to that location. Upon arriving, the driver says that although everything seems calm, there's no guarantee of a sudden attack, and peace is something hard to come by around here. After getting out of the taxi, a man approaches to speak with the boy, asking if he came alone. And that although Jiang Chen is a good fighter, it's going to be tough with just the two of them. The protagonist then asks if Nick had any leads about his boss. As they get into a car, the man says that he already knows the location, and the boy asks if they have prepared some weapons. Nick responds that they're in the back of the vehicle and asks if the young man needs anything. However, Jiang Chen says he's already prepared, and then they head off to the location. When they arrive, the man tells the boy to be careful not to alert anyone, and that he should prepare for battle. Nick then thinks that the young man seemed far too nonchalant and wonders if he would become a deadweight. Jiang Chen says that the people in that area seemed quite sensitive to war. The man asks if the protagonist will really be okay, and mentions that his Chinese kung fu wouldn't be of much use in this situation. Jiang Chen thinks he should give a demonstration of what he can do for the man. He then uses his warehouse and pulls out a weapon from it. Nick is confused as he couldn't believe he hadn't noticed the weapon Jiang was carrying. The boy then walks toward the building and says the man already had his goal, so he didn't need to worry about him. He then grabs a drone that had been made by Yao. After launching the drone, it quickly disappears into the air. Jiang Chen activates the visor on the device and says he will take a look at the total number of people. He then reports that there were 14 people in the building, but 3 were unarmed. He tells Nick to stay outside because he can handle the terrorists inside the building. The man says he trusts Zhang and leaves his boss's life in the young man's hands. Shortly after, the protagonist advances. Inside the building, a group of terrorists is playing cards. One of the men says he's going to the bathroom. Jiang Chen moves through the base, thinking that the genetic drug had been worth every penny. Outside the window, he notices someone using the bathroom. He then eliminates the person with a shot from his weapon. One of the terrorists thinks his companion is taking too long to return. He tells the other men he's going to check on him. He knocks on the bathroom door and asks if the man is okay. However, the protagonist shoots him while hanging from the ceiling. Jang thinks there are still 3 more to kill on that floor. One of the terrorists playing cards says that if they call him a loser again, he'll blow everyone's brains out at the table. But Jiang Chen appears and says he'll do it himself. Before the men can react, they are all killed. On the lower floor, the remaining terrorists hear the gunfire. They start heading upstairs. The protagonist takes a deep breath and shoots one of the men. The rest decide to focus their shots on the spot where the boy is. At that same moment, in the basement, Robert hears the gunfire. He wonders if someone has come to rescue the hostages. A terrorist tells Robert's guard that he should watch over the prisoners because they are going out to provide backup. The guard thinks that he has a bad feeling about this. Jiang Chen then descends the stairs and says everyone can come at him. On the other side of the metal door, the guard hears the gunfire. Moments later, the protagonist opens the door and greets Robert. Robert, in turn, is surprised to see the boy there. The terrorist starts shouting in another language. Jiang Chen is confused as he can't understand a word and asks what the man is yelling. Robert translates that the terrorist is telling the young man to drop his weapon or he'll kill a hostage. The protagonist thinks that if the man was going to make a threat, he should have chosen a more appropriate hostage, because Jiang wasn't there to save that person, but now his life was in the protagonist's hands. Jiang then raises his hands and drops his weapon. The terrorist seizes the opportunity and shoots at the boy. As he approaches Jiang, he wonders if the boy is dead. However, Jiang Chen shoots the man. Robert hugs the young man and thanks him for coming to rescue him, saying it seemed like his Chinese kung fu really helped him dodge bullets. But the protagonist thinks he only managed to block the bullets thanks to his 10-second shield. He had faked his fall, waiting for a chance to shoot when the terrorist let go of the hostage. The boy says they need to go because Nick is waiting for them. Shortly after, Nick contacts them and tells them to get out quickly because the terrorists had called for reinforcements. But no one was at the evacuation point, so they could head up and get into the car. Nick says he has to cut the conversation short because the reinforcements are arriving. While escaping, Robert asks what they will do if they encounter more enemies. Jiang Chen pulls him into an alley because he had seen the men through his drone. Meanwhile, Nick is wounded by gunfire. He receives information that the protagonist and Robert are already in the car, but he says he's surrounded and tells them to flee without him. Jiang Chen, in turn, tells Nick to head into an alley at 6 o'clock. Nick thinks the enemy fire is too intense, but he decides to take the risk. The protagonist uses his drone to guide Nick through the escape route. Upon reaching the vehicle, Nick says he didn't think he'd make it out alive. But Jiang Chen says they aren't out of the woods yet, as the terrorists have blocked nearly all the roads. Robert suggests heading toward the desert to see if they can reach a safe city. As he drives, the man says they have enough gas to cross the desert and circle to the north. The protagonist thinks that the place they're heading could also be terrorist territory, and that had he known it would be this problematic, he wouldn't have accepted the mission, but now he would see it through to the end. Besides, he was taking the opportunity to test his equipment. What surprised the boy the most was that he no longer felt anything when killing another human being. Shortly after, the car breaks down. Nick says the engine has overheated. Jiang Chen wonders how they can be so unlucky. Then a vehicle approaches the group. Robert begins to speak, telling everyone to lower their weapons because they're saved. As the man approaches the truck, Jiang Chen says the people appear to be refugees. When Robert returns, he says the driver agreed to take them along on his journey. Inside the truck, the protagonist tells Nick that his boss really got along with the refugees. However, the boy notices that the man has fallen asleep. Jiang Chen feels uncomfortable because everyone in the truck is staring at him. Soon after, they all stop for lunch. The boy eats a biscuit he pulled from his dimensional storage, but it still doesn't feel real, because 6 months ago he was just another person in a job queue, and now he was in the middle of the desert. He then notices a girl staring at him as he eats. He approaches and introduces himself to her. She introduces herself as Aisha. Jiang Chen follows the customs of her people and sits down properly. He then gives her a packet of biscuits. Aisha eats the food quickly, but cherishes each bite. The protagonist thinks it seems like she hadn't eaten in a long time. He then asks if she had decided what she would do when they reach the next city. The girl says she's heading to a refugee camp to receive some humanitarian aid and then see if anyone is willing to buy her. The boy decides that this is the time to stay silent. The next day, Robert tells the driver that he could hire him and that he doesn't need to worry about his visa because he has a pass with the Congress. But then the truck comes under attack. Jiang Chen prevents Aisha from falling out of the vehicle. A group of men get out of their cars. They pull Robert out of the truck, saying to take him as a hostage. One of the men orders them to search the area. Aisha tells Jiang that those terrorists are slave traders. She explains that they live in the desert, raiding villages. The women become slaves, and the men either join them or are killed. The girl says that if possible, she'd like to at least keep her chastity, and asks if the boy could give her one of the bullets from his gun. However, Jiang Chen says he won't do that. Aisha is surprised, saying she prays for his success. One of the men shoots into the air, saying that the harvest would be good. As they try to open the truck, Nick and Jiang Chen break their necks. The boy says he's going to save Robert. He then grabs one of the fallen men's guns and shoots at the bandits. As they resist, the men shoot back at the boy. However, he activates his 10-second shield. One of the terrorists says to grab Robert to use him as a hostage, but Robert manages to grab one of the guns, and he shoots one of the bandits. Before the terrorists can do anything, Jiang Chen knocks out the last of them. Nick asks if his boss is okay, and Robert responds that he has a backache. Then Robert asks what they're going to do next, and he replies that they'll have to walk the rest of the way. The protagonist asks what they'll do about the refugees. The men stare at him, unable to protect themselves, while the boy is thinking about the refugees. Robert says that once they reach the next city, they'll be free. And as for the humanitarians, they should leave them behind because it's not their concern. And that with the fuel they have, they can get close to the safe zone, so they can warn the refugees of the dangers. But if they take them, they'll become targets too. The rest of the journey was quite peaceful. No terrorist group appeared, nor was there even a sandstorm. But now they had an extra passenger. Robert explained the situation to all the refugees, and Jiang Chen said they should get going. However, Aisha tugged on the protagonist's shirt. He asked what happened. The girl then spoke in her language. Jiang Chen asked Robert to translate for him, but the man felt embarrassed to translate. The boy assumed she was hungry and decided to give her a bag of biscuits, but the girl shook her head and asked them to take her with him. Jiang Chen remembered what she had told him before, and then thought he could manage to get her to a safe place. He then invited the girl to continue the journey with them. Inside the car, the protagonist asked Robert what she had said earlier. Robert explained that she was willing to lie with him as a reward for killing all the bandits. Jiang Chen blushed at the translation. Robert then asked what he thought about polygamy. The boy replied that he wasn't married. Right after, he thought it could get complicated, but he believed that with money, her problem could be solved. When they arrived at their destination, Robert asked if they thought any familiar faces were still around. Aisha became alert, wondering what those people were doing. Jiang Chen told the girl that they were in a safe place, and that they were just waiting for a few people to resolve the situation. The girl remained silent. Then Blues appeared, asking the boy if he still remembered him. Jiang Chen was surprised to see him there as well. Blues said he was currently just handling security for his new boss. His name was Lawrence, a detective from the United States, and he needed to deal with an issue involving Robert, who had crossed his line of interest. Jiang Chen asked if it was okay for him to tell him about that. Blues, in turn, asked if Nick hadn't informed him. The protagonist said Nick only explained the plan and then remained silent. Lawrence told Blues not to leak information to foreigners and said he needed to accompany him to the headquarters. Blues then bid farewell to the protagonist. Robert explained that Blues, being a mercenary, worked for whoever paid the most, and this time his boss was about to be promoted. Due to making arms deals in certain regions, it could upset some people, so this was done to prevent a specific situation. He advised taking an arms dealer as an example and always watching the direction artillery was headed. It was a deal he would never make again, something to cover up his crude oil negotiations. The girl's name was Aisha, and she was 17, born in a war-torn country. When she was little, she had learned a bit about life in other countries through TV. At first, she thought that all those clean and paved streets and all that peaceful life were everyone's dream, like being in a movie. However, she soon discovered that her life could also be a movie, but in those films where peaceful civilians died to satisfy the thirst for violence. Her parents always refused to meet the demands of those demons and were soon killed. Like the rest of the people, she ended up becoming an exile, wandering to escape the war and trying to survive, until the protagonist appeared to help her. Taking down the demons who committed evil, he saved her from a miserable and humiliating death. Jiang never rejected her, even though she had been dirty for quite some time. He simply took her in. For that reason, at that moment, she felt it was time to repay the favor he had done for her. Seeing that he was covered in sweat, she mentioned that she would clean him up. With a certain lump under his blanket, the protagonist was apparently dreaming. And at that moment, he grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her close. The girl found herself wrapped in the protagonist's arms, thinking that this would be the greatest grace ever granted in her life. There was Jiang, and at that very moment, he was returning to China. Next to him was that girl from before. Nervous, the protagonist thought he had broken into a cold sweat. The girl, when she woke up, said the first thing she was going to do was learn to speak Mandarin. Meanwhile, a group of cars seemed to approach the protagonist. Feeling pleased, he thought they had reunited again, and he needed to thank his boss for helping him get a passport for Aisha. He asked who the young man in the back seat was. The man responded that it was Mr. Zhang, who was in charge of transportation and temporarily responsible for his security. Then the young man introduced himself, saying his name was Zhang, and he was responsible for trade in the city of Wangai. His boss made a deal with the American Robert. As he observed the protagonist, John noticed that the man was talking to him non-stop. It was the longest conversation he had ever witnessed with that man, as he was usually focused on guarding Robert's most important assets. Although he had said he was there to look after him, Jiang realized he was supervising the deal instead. This meant he was merely someone overseeing shipments with international escort. Saying that the goods were there, the protagonist asked them to follow him. However, Jiang says he'll wait outside because Nick will handle everything. His people were also there to manage the transportation. Entering the place, the other man looks surprised. He says he thought that warehouse was just a meeting point, questioning if Jiang had really left everything in that place. Jiang explains that he did that just to avoid attracting thieves' attention, so they should get inside quickly. Pulling back the cloths, several gold bars are revealed. The group is left astonished by the sheer amount, but that wasn't all. Jiang says there's much more behind. Jiang reflects that he understood their reaction because when he saw Joe fill a pool with gold to the brim, he was equally shocked. The man, in turn, asks why the others are standing still, telling them to start working immediately. Sometime later, the man seems to finish evaluating all the gold. He mentions that the total comes to $500 million, and as soon as he confirms the payment, he'll give the order for his group to start loading the car. At that moment, he receives a notification of the transfer of millions of dollars. Sealing the deal with Jiang, the man says it was a pleasure doing business with him. Then he leaves along with his henchmen. Meanwhile, the protagonist is completely astonished by the amount of money now in his account. However, to him, it still wasn't much. Recalling a flashback where he mentioned that it was probably the last shipment of gold, and once it was over, he would need to shift to another business. The other man had asked what industry he planned to move into. Jiang responded that it would be the tech world. In the present, he thinks it's still not enough as 350 million isn't even a third of what future technologies will be worth. At that moment, he receives a phone call. Apparently, it's Xia, who sounds very worried, telling the protagonist to hurry over. An hour and a half later, Jiang arrives at her apartment. She says the boy finally returned and asks if he remembers the USB she had sent. Saying he remembers, Jiang asks if there was any problem with the game. However, Xia says there was nothing wrong, because the person who developed the game was simply a genius. Everything was in order, and they could even create an online game that could be a masterpiece in gaming history. But it was the protagonist's company, and even though she was in charge of almost all the work, there were still many formalities and documents that needed his signature. However, Jiang is always out every day, leaving her alone to handle security. Jiang asks her to relax, assuring her that she'll be paid for all of it. Xia asks him to call her next time and not return to her home once again. The boy asks if she had already chosen a location to establish the company, and Xia says she was about to give him an update on recruitment from the last time. Talking about the company's development, she says the mobile game had been submitted for approval and it didn't contain any overly sensitive content, so she believes they'll receive the results soon. She starts explaining various things about the company, and the protagonist seems to understand none of it. Xia says that if they don't hurry to make a profit with employees' salaries and equipment purchases, the company will certainly go bankrupt. However, Jiang doesn't seem to care much, thinking that his manager had no idea about his resources because with his economic power, the company couldn't fail even if it tried. Xia says she's not joking because it's his company on the line. Noticing how dedicated she was, Jiang suggests making a capital injection. Xia says that probably wouldn't work and asks how much the president was planning to inject. He responds that 10 million should be enough. However, noticing the girl's silence, he raises the amount and asks if 100 million would suffice. Then Xia says she was serious about what she said. Jiang responds that he was serious too, and that tomorrow they go together to the industrial sector to handle all the paperwork. However, she seems hesitant. She asks if he has a lot of money and why he's able to finance a company. Observing her, the protagonist wonders if she's trying to win him over. Meanwhile, in the futuristic world, a ship crashes into a building. The young man's name was Chu, and he had lost contact with the captain during a routine collection of a large crystal source. Now he seemed a bit desperate amid the intense heat of an explosion. To be precise, he hadn't followed the captain's order to evacuate the transport vehicle, so he believed that's what saved him. But his colleagues weren't as fortunate. Moreover, his communication equipment had already failed. He thinks that while he was unconscious, there must have been a massive electromagnetic pulse explosion that even caused his microchip to malfunction. So he needed to check his gear. With what he had left on his weapon, he still had 5 cartridges, 2 syringes, and his nutrient supplies for food. If this was all he had, he would have to push beyond his limits and find his captain. The elevator wasn't working, but at least there weren't many zombies on the higher floors. Meanwhile, several zombies roamed the area. The man thinks he's reached the ground, but it took too long and it was already almost night. So he needed to find a survivor base or somewhere to spend the night. Thus, he decided to take advantage of the remaining daylight, and since these things were slow, he needed to find a way out of the city. When the war started, everyone was evacuating the metropolises, so those cars must have been heading toward the suburbs. For this reason, he needed to hurry. Meanwhile, a girl seems surprised, wondering why no one has shown up yet. It was getting dark and she needed to hold out a little longer. Then that man from before appears, noticing a girl trapped somewhere. While hiding, the girl calls for help. Seeing her, the man wonders who had done that to her. He couldn't leave her there, but he needed to be very cautious. As he whispers, he tells her not to worry because he's there to save her. He reassures her that everything will be fine. As soon as he unties her, the girl hugs him, and with a malicious smile, she thanks him. However, at that moment, 2 armed men appear. They immediately point a gun at his head. It was the green-haired guy from long ago saying that he was the first fool of the month to take the bait. The other girl, with a knife to her neck, apologizes for what she did. So for trying to save someone, Pores ended up falling into a trap and was captured by a group of bandits. Inside a hideout, one of the thugs says they checked the man, and he was the first big catch they'd had in a while. because he had lots of good items and equipment on him. Congratulating the girl from before, the other man thinks they should now roast that big fish, asking if the guy had a name. Responding that his name was Chu, the other man asks where he came from. Chu replies that he was from the city of Liuding from the Air Force. Thinking the man might be trying to trick him, he asks where his aircraft is. Chu responds that it simply crashed near a building. The man asks if Chu is still acting all cocky, and Chu asks if he's interested in his equipment, and since he's gotten it, maybe he should let him go. However, the man orders them to take him away. Looking to the side, Chu notices the girl from before and thinks her previous owner was a fool. And his boss took his time catching that fish, and in the end, the guy died and left behind a poor position as a messenger. But luckily, he took the bait, so they could keep his stuff. Meanwhile, back where the protagonist is, Shia asks if he's trying to win her over. The protagonist simply asks what she's talking about. Shia thinks that from the beginning, it seems suspicious, like he wanted to start a company, but she had convinced herself it was just her imagination until now. A company is built to generate profit, but since he managed to gather 100 million in less than a year, she questions why he'd start one and take such a big risk, wondering why the boy had started to like her. And on top of that, she had caused him a lot of trouble, forcing him to quit that job. Questioning the reason for doing something in that way, as she didn't want to be any kind of trophy. But that could be the new generation of the rich creating a company to keep it under control, wondering how much it would cost to escape this time. Thus, she could be deceived again. And the boy quickly says that 100 billion would only be a fraction of what the company would be worth in the future, stating that she was right to have made a lot of money. Questioning if he looked like a greedy person to her, finding it amusing to leave money locked up in a bank. But that wasn't what the boy wanted. And if the girl thought he was doing it for her, she was right. It takes a business genius to establish a company that doesn't need the boss's intervention besides having employees who work hard. Touching on that subject, with 100 million, he could make her life even more incredible. Observing the girl, he realizes that she was still silent, wondering if that would be a problem and thinking that bosses aren't usually as nice as employees. At the same moment, the girl stands up, apparently asking the boy to leave her house, mentioning that it was late and they had a lot to do the next day, so he shouldn't forget what she had pointed out. Leaving the place, Zhang thinks that girl had a lot of self-esteem. The next day, that same girl seems to be eating something. Zhang thinks that for her, it must be quite difficult, so he should get a house and solve that problem soon. But first, he needs to send a message to Xia, then he would drop Aisha off at her Chinese class. Looking at a specific building, he wonders if that was the place where he would train the girl. Dropping her off at the place, Aisha says goodbye to the protagonist, and the boy responds that when her class is over, he would pick her up, thinking that after that, he needed to go to the commercial district. Getting into a car, the boy asks the driver to go to the Commerce Bank on a specific street. Greeting him, Shia asks if by any chance he had slept well, and the boy thinks she wouldn't answer that question. She says that in the next few weeks, there would be job interviews at a specific university, and so he should go with her. Zhang says they should discuss that later as they needed to solve the liquidity problem, starting to discuss several things about his work. Sometime later, the protagonist already seems to have returned to the apocalyptic world, supposing that this time he didn't make a good landing, because, as he remembered, that was the basement of his house and should have gotten used to fall in there before, wondering what had happened while he was away. Then a group of people seems to be moving something with a device. Zhang thinks that if it weren't for the village landscape, he wouldn't have recognized his own house, questioning where Jiao was and why there was such an incredible silence. Then a girl in the background asks if he had finally decided to return. Zhang asks her not to scare him like that and to never sneak up on him so quietly. Jiao asks why he was so startled and with whom he had slept this time. Zhang asks when she had arrived, as he hadn't even noticed, and if she wasn't too busy, it would be good to know what was happening and if she could inform him about it. However, the girl remains silently observing him, thinking that the boy really knew how to act. And sooner or later, she would get back at him, starting to talk about the various things that had happened in her territory, asking him to follow her as they would talk while walking, mentioning that Yahello still hadn't woken up and was probably sleeping as they were coming back. Zhang thinks that she had come close because if she had taken it further, he wouldn't have known how to respond. While the group of people greets the protagonist, the girl responds that this was the community center they were developing, and they had also fortified the perimeter defenses by installing machine guns, but for now, they were only serving to defend against zombies and survivors, mentioning that in 2 months they would add weapons to them. Observing those weapons, Zhang thinks that each of them was very expensive and asks how the negotiations with Zhao's group were going. Zhao responds that at the beginning of August, the volume of crystals was among the materials they had traded, but for the constructions. Zhang thinks that a few days ago, she was like a lioness for losing a few potatoes, but now she was talking about a lot of money without even blinking, saying that it went very well and that to build a proper base, one can't skimp on money. Thinking that he had assumed she was only good at killing and had never suggested she would be so competent, the girl in turn mentions that the surrounding survivor groups had already noticed them and wanted to make contact, and there were about 57 groups around their base between large and medium groups. Jiang thinks that was a lot, and when he tried to make some money at that time, he was attacked by a mercenary group in Block 6. Even if it's not worth it for those survivors, the only reason Zhou's group does him attack is due to the support of his company. Zhou says that's why they took countermeasures, implementing rules that prohibited eating outside the continuous zone or lighting any kind of flame, making it clear that the entry of any survivor was forbidden, and as for how to deal with them, they thought it better to wait for the protagonist's decision. Observing the situation, Jiang asks what the base's capacity was at that moment. The girl responds that she brought other virtual training capsules, and as a result, everyone that could handle weapons and fight. Sometime later, the girl ends up showing him the capsules, mentioning that this was one of the first models that had come out. Additionally, they were training the soldiers with genetic medications and had already used the last shipment of 50 syringes of Class D medication. Jiang asks if by any chance those could be used to learn another type of language. Replying yes, the girl asks why he wanted to learn another language. The protagonist thinks he should give one of those to Aisha along with the genetic medications, as that way he could have a beautiful bodyguard and driver, mentioning that he would use it for something, and for that reason, he was going to take one. Saying that since they had a fixed armed force in that place, they could solve the problems of the other survivors, asking to establish a trading center at the entrance of the base. Additionally, they were to sell biscuits to the scattered survivors, exchanging them for crystals. Zhou asks why they would trade that, as she didn't think they would be able to buy anything useful from them. The protagonist says it could be anything useful and the value didn't matter, they just needed to know they would work for them. That way, they could gain trust over time and also make it clear they weren't trying to compete. Observing the situation, Jiang thinks he was right, noting that those people weren't easy to control. After all, they had a microchip. However, Jiang asks her to relax and stop worrying, because they were increasing their manual labor and that first shipment of helpers they got could keep up with the work, asking her not to forget to give 30 crystals to each person as a salary, since they couldn't keep them as volunteers forever. Soon after, the girl seems to be impressed, saying that she never thought he would care about the other side, which is why she misinterpreted things. The boy responds that of course he cares, since that was his home. Then Zhou asks with whom he had slept the previous night, making him uneasy with that question. Shortly after, the girl seems to open a capsule, throwing the boy inside it, mentioning that since he had gone silent again, she would have to ask his big guy. Sometime later, a young man seems to be analyzing something. Looking around, Jiang thinks that this was the back-end development lab. The boy, on the other hand, is surprised as the young man was so focused that he hadn't even noticed his presence. Looking down, he notices the 2 cell phones he had brought earlier for Yahello. Shortly after, the young man notices the protagonist, feeling happy because his boss had finally returned, saying that he had checked several times for Mrs. Sun, who had made him look for the bug countless times before showing it to the protagonist. Jiang mentions that she had been very busy and for that reason, she couldn't be at the base. He asks how it all turned out. Grabbing the cell phone, the man asks if he would like to take a look. Observing the cell phone, the protagonist thinks the man really worked hard on it and that there was no problem. Not to mention that very high-tech screen, which looked amazing. At that moment, on the cell phone screen, a sort of NPC appears, introducing itself as his assistant. Surprised, Jiang wonders what that was. And when he goes to access the cell phone, that thing simply follows him everywhere. The protagonist asks if that thing could hear him, and it quickly responds that it was his loyal assistant. And if he needed to open any app, he just had to access the menu that way. But it recommended that he ask it to do so. The other man says that if he found the assistant too annoying, he could operate in text mode. The young man thinks that this was no small thing, as that assistant had the same level of language and intelligence as they did. Moreover, it was the NPC that initiated a conversation with the protagonist, and it was completely different from those audio receivers in his world. Speaking again, the assistant apologizes because there was no game on that cell phone yet, but it would need to search the network if there was a request. Then the man asked to plug that cable into the cell phone, as he had forgotten earlier. That way, the artificial intelligence could help with the search, but there was no compatible server in that place. However, he had backed up data from 2017 to 2027, so he could help search for whatever was needed. Then Jiang asked to download a racing game with the best graphics it could find. Sometime later, the assistant had already downloaded the game, asking him to enjoy it. Noticing all those graphics, Jiang thinks they were very realistic with effects like computer games, wondering if that was really a cell phone. Observing the protagonist, the man wonders why he was so amazed by such primitive technology. Jiang, on the other hand, says that he did a good job, and from that day on, he would be the Minister of Communication and Technology at the survival base. And as a reward, his payment would be increased to 1 can of premium meat every day. Surprised, the man thanks the protagonist for his generosity, thinking that he must be dreaming. Sometime later, it was already night, and the protagonist had returned once again to his world. As he walked towards his house, he thinks it seemed like every time he went to see his house, it was nighttime. Shortly after ringing the girl's doorbell, waiting for a long time, no one had appeared. Thinking that she really wasn't going to open the door, he assumes it might be because he had gone only at night. However, he didn't do it on purpose since he didn't have much time left, and as soon as he grabbed the USB, he returned to his world. wondering if he should leave but not wanting to waste the trip. Grabbing his phone, he asked his assistant to call Xia. Seemingly out of breath, the girl finally wakes up. Noticing her state, the boy asks why that was happening, and Xia replies that it was nothing. She was just a bit tired. Apparently in a luxury house, she apologizes for being a little drowsy. The boy, on the other hand, mentions that he had gotten the operating system, and for that reason he needed her to take a look at it, and that they needed to get it online as soon as possible, asking if she could open the door for him. Apparently with a cold, Xia asks him to just leave the USB. Realizing the girl wasn't well, the boy offers to take her to the hospital. However, Xia seems reluctant to go, saying that she just needed to take her medication and be on her way. But the boy says that wasn't a request. Picking her up in his arms, he says he was going to take her to the car. Sometime later, the two arrive at the hospital. About to help the girl stand up, she asks him to wait, mentioning that she didn't need his help and that she could walk on her own. Jiang thinks he didn't understand this woman as he had carried her earlier, but now at the hospital, she could walk on her own. At that moment, Xia slips, and the protagonist catches her to prevent her from falling. Telling her to be careful, he asks if she wanted to add another problem to deal with. While carrying the girl into the hospital, several people were watching them, thinking they were a couple. Sometime later, the protagonist seems to be observing Xia talking with a group of doctors, thinking they had said it was just a cold, but she had been inside for a while now, and if it was something serious, she should be hospitalized. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, the girl is asking about her father's condition. The doctor responds that they were quite worried because rabies is a very serious disease. The boy says that's impossible, as his father was never bitten by a dog, so he questions how he could have contracted rabies. However, the doctor seems hesitant to say anything. The woman says they didn't have any dogs and her father didn't even go near one, questioning how he could have contracted the disease. The doctor responds that the incubation period for the disease varies between a week and a year, and if a rabies vaccine is not administered in time, it becomes nearly impossible to cure. Frustrated, the other boy asks if the doctor was saying his father might not survive. Then the doctor, seemingly desperate, asks him to calm down. Meanwhile, the protagonist observes the situation, thinking there seemed to be some sort of influence, since the doctor was hardly contradicting himself, and besides that, the people around seemed quite scared by it all. Looking at the boy's clothes, they seemed normal, but his physique and posture indicated he was a soldier. At the same time, another man asked the protagonist why he was staring so much. Jiang wonders if they were together and if that man was supposed to be the boy's subordinate. Irritated, the boy says he had asked the protagonist a question, who simply ignores him and starts fiddling with his phone. The man at that moment sits next to the protagonist. The assistant notifies him that it's already midnight, asking if the protagonist wasn't going to sleep. Our boy responds that he still had to take care of something, so the assistant could go to sleep first. The man, on the other hand, asks to take a look at his phone, but Jiang simply ignores him, leaving the man completely irritated by the protagonist's attitude. Punching him, he says that he had given the boy a chance. However, the young man easily blocks the punch. The boy wonders if the protagonist was about to challenge him. Jiang, irritated, thinks that the more he tried to avoid trouble, the more it appeared. Meanwhile, the woman who was with the protagonist observes the situation, asking what the man was doing. Apparently, the man becomes afraid of the girl, asking him to release the boy immediately. The man thinks he had already let go, but that monstrous kid wouldn't let go of his hand, and he was just too embarrassed to ask for help. Shortly after, the man, who apparently was the soldier, observes the commotion. Approaching the two, he mentions that Jiang was quite talented, asking which martial arts school he was from, requesting that they let the matter go. Thinking his friend was a good fighter on the battlefield, but now he was completely powerless against the young man's grip. Jiang, on the other hand, is surprised, thinking that it's in moments like these that the boss shows up to defend his subordinate, wondering what the man was talking about as he thought he was fighting the man's subordinate. Observing his posture, he assumes he was wrong, which meant that the man might not be a soldier, and he thought he must really enjoy martial arts even more. The boy says he had only used a little strength, and the man responds that he was quite strong, asking if he wasn't interested in joining his special forces. However, the protagonist ends up declining the offer, and the girl asks if he was going crazy, pointing out that their father was still bedridden, questioning how he dared to try and recruit someone at a time like that. Apologizing, the girl explains that her brother was a rude man. Jiang feels relieved, thinking that if it weren't for that girl, a commotion could have happened. Asking the man to open his gallery of photos and videos, Jiang mentions there was nothing suspicious, and that he was just there to help his friend and didn't want any trouble with anyone. Thanking him for that, the woman responds that she wouldn't bother him again. Apologizing for the incident, the young man says they were about to leave, and the girl mentions they were closing the account. However, she notices that her brother hadn't given up yet, asking the protagonist if he had any idea how to cure rabies, leaving everyone around surprised by what the young man had said. Laughing at the man, the protagonist wonders if he looked like a doctor. The girl asks them to just accept reality as they would take care of it together. Jiang, observing the man, notices that he was very excited, thinking that curing that disease wouldn't be a problem as he had some vials of Class D medication that could help cure rabies gradually. Moreover, he could have used some of that to cure Xia, instead of needing to go to the hospital. Then the young man asks for the protagonist's name, to which he responds that his name was Jiang. The boy responds that his name was Xingong and his sister was Xinren, asking if Jiang could use any secret remedy he had to cure their father, as they would reward him with whatever they had. Jiang thinks he could do that, but the problem would be what would happen afterward, as if it were a simple family. He could cure him, and it would all just be a misdiagnosis. But since they weren't from a simple family, it could end up bringing a lot of tension. On the other hand, precisely because they were powerful, he could end up taking advantage of them and earning more money, which could be considered a double-edged sword. For that reason, you would have to see what kind of people they were. But at that moment, the other girl interrupts the situation again, saying they should stop, questioning whether they would risk having someone use techniques on their father. The doctor agrees, saying that his sister was right and that they should trust them. At that moment, the protagonist says he could try to do something to help. The man says that as the doctor in charge, he needed to protect his patient, asking the young man not to get involved. And the woman says she didn't trust him, mentioning that her father was the secretary of the Wang High Council. The protagonist, for his part, says that he hated when people doubted him, and whether her father was cured or not would be their problem, as he wanted to make it clear that they were the ones who bothered him with this, and he was just offering help. Besides, the woman should already know that medical procedures would never cure that kind of disease. Then the boy says he trusted the protagonist, because when someone with rabies manifests symptoms, the mortality rate rises to 100%, and the death is very painful, so they should trust the protagonist even if there was only a 1% chance of helping them. Impressed, Jiang thinks that after all, that boy wasn't so foolish. Standing up, he says he only needed 10 minutes and didn't want anyone to interrupt him during that time. The doctor, about to interrupt the situation, is stopped by the other man, who says he would take responsibility and was placing his trust in the protagonist. The girl, about to say something, is interrupted by the protagonist, who asks her not to say anything else. The girl thinks that maybe her brother is right, and if their father isn't treated, he will end up dying, so this was their only gamble. Looking to the side, Jiang notices a camera watching him, thinking that a grenade could solve that. Using the camera, he successfully conceals himself in the room, quickly grabbing a siren from his portal, thinking that the man was already in a coma, so he wouldn't need to explain anything. Sometime later, our boy exits the room, and the other woman asks how the operation went. The young man simply replies that her father needed to sleep a little. The woman asks if she would have his phone number, as when her father wakes up, he should thank him. Noticing the situation, the protagonist thinks she must still be very worried. Handing her something, he says that it was his card and that his phone number could also be found on the hospital's records. However, the other man says they didn't need the card, just his number to exchange contacts, because from now on, he would be his brother and no one would ever dare to touch him again. At that moment, a noise comes from the door where their father was. Jiang responds that their father had a very strong body, so he must already be awake. Immediately, both of them head towards their father, who, with tears in his eyes, is happy to feel well again. The doctor, on the other hand, questions what method was used, since over 55,000 people die of rabies every year. However, the young man says that this secret couldn't be revealed, thinking that in due time he might tell, but for now he needed to keep that information so that no one would use it for their own benefit. Their father, waking up, asks if they were at the hospital, as he remembered contracting rabies. The man says they had found an incredible doctor to treat him. Xingong, joyful, says that fortunately, the disease was finally cured. The woman admits that she hated to admit it, but her brother had indeed found a doctor capable of curing him. Realizing the situation, the man says that if that was the case, he wouldn't complain about anything. He just needed to thank him, asking how the treatment went and where the doctor was, because he would like to visit him someday. His son responds that the doctor was right there, but about 15 minutes ago, they'd brought him back in. Surprised, the man wonders how on earth he treated that disease and who sent that doctor. Irritated, the woman asks why they didn't get the protagonist's number, and the young man responds that he was about to get it but rushed to see their father. Their father responds that if they searched, they would eventually find him, and now he needed to rest a bit, asking the two of them to leave. Since he hadn't died yet, he needed to take care of some things. The artificial intelligence believed that anyone with internet access was familiar with the term. It always antagonizes the human race and in the end is defeated by the protagonist. And there was current society continuing to develop and explore artificial intelligence. However, it was still an unexplored field and it would take years to master it. The person in front of the computer was a professional hacker, and that was just a game. His futuristic company thought it was invincible, but soon they would pay dearly when their system fell into the hands of a professional. A week later, a man seems to be apologizing to his boss, saying that Gu Sheng from the department had failed. The boss questions whether giving him the freedom to choose his own technicians wasn't enough and asks how the hacking attempt was going. However, the young man once again says there had been almost no progress. The boss says he doesn't blame the team and asks to forget about it, as from what he knew, the other companies were in the same situation. He asks what the current information was and if it had already been summarized. Handing over a document, the young man says all the information was there. The boss asks him to get in touch with the protagonist, owner of the futuristic company, to discuss acquisition rights, offering $20 million to negotiate. The same thing was happening in the offices of various internet moguls, and even the most renowned players knew this young man born in China. Thus, the protagonist ended up awakening great interest, and all of this was processed in the blink of an eye. At that exact moment, at the center of this storm was the protagonist, calmly eating an apple. His assistant mentions that there was a total investment of 590,000 yuan in the market, which included ghost influencers hired to create a buzz. She mentions that they had broken several records that week. However, for the protagonist, that still wasn't enough. Meanwhile, the girl continues talking about the events, mentioning that at that exact moment, 12 companies wanted to form partnerships and make acquisitions, and the protagonist asks her to schedule some time for them. At that moment, Sia mentions that someone had offered $13 million. However, the protagonist responds that he wouldn't sell even for $130 million, questioning how they dared offer such a small amount. Xie, in turn, asks if his company didn't need to be patented. Surprised, Jiang asks if there was really a way to patent software in China, thinking that no one would be able to bypass his system for the next 50 years, and by the time they got there, they wouldn't even know what version Futurista had reached. However, Sia responds that she had an idea. Stating that it wasn't easy to set up an office, she suggested that he have more control over his work environment and act accordingly. As she was leaving the room, Jiang asks her to call him by his first name only. Fezia responds that they were at work, so she asks him to keep personal matters separate. Meanwhile, inside a university, a girl asks to hurry and see her new baby. Along with her was that woman from earlier, who had gotten angry at the protagonist, showing her cell phone to the woman. Surprised, the woman asks if it was some kind of virtual patch, and the girl asks her to just try talking to it. Speaking to the phone, she says her friend didn't believe it could talk and asks if it could sing a song for her. However, that assistant says it didn't care what others thought. For it was enough that its mistress liked it. Standing up, the assistant says it would do as she requested, asking what kind of music the woman liked as it would play something to her taste. The woman asked if there was a human behind this. The assistant responded that it was just artificial intelligence. Surprised, the girl asked how they managed to create it as even the actions were not repetitive. Her friend says she knew how she felt because she was also shocked at first, but it didn't stop there, as it could also increase the phone's speed by 3 times. The girl thinks that it could become even faster, which could be used in the industrial sector, in the environment, or even as aerospace technology. Thus, the creator of that artificial intelligence put it in such a small phone. Placing the phone on the table, she asked the AI to take some beautiful pictures. Sometime later, the assistant does as requested. Then the girl asks again to share those photos on her contacts app, mentioning that the program was called Futurista 1.0 and could be downloaded on any phone with internet as it took up very little space. Additionally, she warns to be cautious of the numerous imitations that already existed, because it was already super popular and she heard it broke a download record on the first day. The woman, on the other hand, asks why she was so proud, as it seemed like she had made the program herself. Convinced, the girl responds that she heard the president of that company was a former student of that university, and also that a girl from the student union said that in the morning they would be going to the school to recruit more students. The girl mentioned she wasn't even studying, questioning why she was so excited. Meanwhile, the protagonist was beside Xia, analyzing something. The girl responds that 14 more imitations of his program had appeared, and among them, 7 were using the name White as advertising. Jiang replies that the internet users weren't fools and surely knew what was fake, but he thought they needed a legal team for the company, thinking that it was a big problem because if it were a program without emotions, even with several security gaps, people wouldn't feel threatened. He says they needed to provide a guarantee, and if users experienced monetary loss due to a program error, Futuristas would fully compensate them. Kexia asks what would happen if there was a security breach, and the protagonist responds that it was impossible, replying that she could trust him because they wouldn't be hacked and now the rest was up to her. Shortly after, a girl appears, mentioning that the fair would open at 9 o'clock, specifically in 30 minutes. Then a woman says it was almost time, asking not to put too much pressure on the students. Jiang says it could be left to Xia, as he trusted she would take care of the recruitment. Then the girl asks him not to be too surprised when the crowd shows up. The protagonist thinks he had already seen a crowd of refugees fighting for food in the future, and for that reason, an event like this was nothing special. At that moment, a huge line appears, waiting for the protagonist. The other man says he had heard a lot about Jiang, mentioning that he was a computer engineer. Shortly after, countless people start introducing themselves. Sometime later, the protagonist is completely exhausted after evaluating all the candidates. Surprised that Xia didn't seem tired, the girl responds that she was used to it. Observing the young man, she wonders where he was going. Shortly after, Jiang returns with 2 cups of coffee, asking the girl to take a break. She thanks him for his kindness. Sometime later, the protagonist ends up falling asleep. The girl thinks that despite being laid back, he still cared a lot about others. Time passes again, and Jiang is once more looking for more people. Then that girl from before begins to introduce herself to the protagonist, After listing all her skills, she says she is a fanatic user of his app. Jiang wonders where that airhead came from after all the nonsense he had heard. Kexia, on the other hand, asks what the girl would do first if she were his legal advisor. The girl responds that she would sue those guys for infringement. The boy thinks she seemed interesting but was too emotional, and in the legal field, there's no room for mistakes. Just as he was about to say something, Xia asks him to let her finish speaking. Listening to what she said, Xia is surprised, thinking that the girl covered all the legal bases with specific measures. However, Jiang didn't understand anything she was talking about, completely lost in the conversation. Shortly after, the girl thanks them, mentioning that's all she wanted to say. Jiang thinks she was clear with her words, and because of that, very interesting, wondering if they had found the right person. He asked the girl if she could spare some of her time because they needed to talk about her salary and benefits. Shaking hands, it seems they sealed the contract, leaving the girl completely thrilled with what she had achieved in her life. Meanwhile, at the celebratory dinner, the host announces that they were going to invite the internet superstar, who was only 23 years old. Shortly after, the protagonist is walking among the crowd. Sometime later, it seems he finished his presentation, thinking that Xia had tricked him with that whole thing about maintaining the company's image, so he had to memorize the speech she had written. Meanwhile, that woman from earlier seems to be watching our boy. Surprised because that was Jiang, she thinks things were getting more interesting now. Sometime later, our boy is looking at the view, thinking that all those discussions were just meaningless chatter and that as soon as the career event ended, he would leave immediately. Noticing the woman behind him, he asks who she is. She, in turn, asks if he had forgotten her from that time at the hospital. Recognizing the girl, he realizes it was the woman from before, saying he didn't expect her to be that famous man's daughter. Jiang says it seemed like they studied at the same school and asks if she came there to make a partnership with him. Then the girl says that at that moment, she just wanted to ask him one question, mentioning that she wasn't there to try and discover the secret of his business, but as the editor of the campus newspaper, she would just like to interview the brilliant former student of that school. Thus, the interview lasted an hour and a half, but she only asked trivial questions. Finishing everything she wanted to say, she mentions she just had one more question, asking for his phone number. Entering the number into her phone, he says that she was already using his products. Saying yes, the girl mentions that her father wanted to meet the person who saved him, but John probably already knew that, stating that he was more excited than ever and wanted to talk to the protagonist. For that reason, she needed Jiang to visit him soon. Jiang, thinking that yet another untouchable girl had appeared, says goodbye to her, thinking that her father was a big shot in the government. So whatever happened, his company would depend on what Wang Dehai decided. Sometime later in the future, the protagonist appears to be wearing armor. All of this started when Jiang had returned to the future again. A week ago, the boy seems to have returned to the apocalyptic world, thinking that the company wasn't even in order yet, but still Jiang had returned to his home, mentioning it had been a long time since he had come back. At that moment, he notices that the place is eerily quiet, wondering where Jiao and Yao Yao were because he wasn't hearing anything from the construction site, wondering if they had already finished building but not believing that possibility. However, he realizes there was no one around, questioning what had happened and where everyone had gone. At that moment, a message appears for the boy, telling him to meet her at the far end of the wall, reminding him to put on the filtration device. Meanwhile, Joe thinks that the protagonist should be arriving soon, mentioning that the situation was more difficult than she thought. Shortly after, Jiang appears climbing the stairs, asking what had happened and why everyone had stopped building. The girl asked him to see for himself, as things were not normal. It all started around a month ago when the zombies outside began to rage, surrounding the entire base, so they couldn't attract more attention with the noise from construction, mentioning that they could be affected by something. They were not only active at night as usual, but now they were active during the day as well. She still didn't know why, but the level of mutant bacteria in the air had risen, and that's why it was necessary to wear masks. Everyone who received booster or genetic vaccines had immunity to resist it, but the bacteria level was rising and becoming similar to that of the zombies. Jiang mentions that he remembers when it was said they moved based on photosynthesis. Jiao replies that normally the zombies would be peacefully walking during the day to carry the spores in their cerebral cortex, and then they would only rage at night. The protagonist asks if that bacteria eliminated the need for that and if it could have entered the zombies' bodies, adapting to them. The girl replies that it could be a possibility, though they had no scientific proof. At that moment, Jiao says that her sources from Block 6 had informed her that the bacteria was coming from some kind of source. Jiang asks what had happened to the survivors near the base and how they had reacted to it. Jiao replies that, unfortunately, they were the only base in the region and the largest group of survivors in that area, but even so, they were unable to act. Our protagonist says that letting it continue would be dangerous, so it was necessary to take the initiative and eliminate the source of the bacteria. However, it would be very problematic to leave the base at that moment. The girl comments that it seemed like the bacteria was attracting the zombies to where the humans were, so they wouldn't be able to negotiate with other survivors. Jiang mentions that the sewer entrances were hundreds of meters from Block 6, so they would need to eliminate the source of the bacteria in that place. He mentions that he had a feel in the air that was getting heavier, so it would be difficult to approach. However, Joe says that she would reformulate the battle plan so the next day they would dispatch the troops. But the protagonist says that he would help her as well, but Joe quickly says she didn't agree with that. However, Jang asks her to let him finish speaking, and the girl asks why she should let him do that. He replies that his combat skills weren't bad and that he could escape the battle if something happened. For that reason, he couldn't leave his woman alone in a place like that. However, Jang in his thoughts supposes that if he let her go alone, she would end up killing all the survivors along the way. Reluctantly, the girl says she would let him do it that time, but that he would have to gather more food for the journey. However, that was easy for the young man. Sometime later, the protagonist was talking to Zhao, saying that they shouldn't waste time and should get straight to the point. Jang thinks that Yahello had said that holographic communication only used 1 crystal per minute. Then Zhao replies that he hoped to increase the volume of their exchanges, leaving the protagonist surprised by what he heard, thinking that he had also wanted the same thing. Zhao mentions that they were down to less than 1,000 units of canned fruit. Showing something, the director presents his proposal, leaving the young man surprised by what he had seen, thinking that the proposal had increased significantly, and considering the previous price, it would be about 450,000 crystals. And that was plenty, considering that a battle armor only cost 10,000 crystals.